All right, everyone. All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Sorry.
Talk to the town manager.
Yeah. It is, we're going to call the meeting to order. It is 1:02. This is a scheduled joint session between the town council and the LPA. Today is Thursday, March 9th, and as I said, it is 1:02. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next, the town clerk has asked that we go around and introduce ourselves for the record, so we'll start down there with you, James, if you don't mind. You got to get your microphone.
Jim Bowen.
Pat Vanass, LPA member.
Don Suddeth, LPA member.
Jane Plummer, LPA.
John Arskang, council member.
Jim Anderholt, vice mayor.
It didn't work.
Jim Anderholt, vice mayor.
Anita Saracita, LPA.
Dan Allers, Mayor.
Council.
Is that good enough, Madam Clerk? We also have the town manager and several people out in the audience, some town staff members here. The first item up for discussion is the recovery planning issues. Before we start, I had a chance to speak with Chair Saracita this morning about it and let her know that I was going to do this. So I'm doing it with her blessing, hopefully.
Oh, I don't know about that.
I got to thinking over the last few days and doing some research into the comp plan again, understanding it. I understand that the discussion that we're going to have today is going to probably revolve around a lot around density. And it got me to thinking that the comp plan that we have in place hasn't truly been tested. Although it may be old, it hasn't been tested. It's been challenged. Things have been approved from that. And it just makes me wonder, do we really need to change what is already in place? Do we have to go and arbitrarily give something away that we don't necessarily have to do? We have a plan in place that I believe is a very good plan that allows people an avenue to get to where they potentially want to go as a landowner without having to just automatically say, here, this is what you get, if this, then that. So I wanted to put that out there because it made me think a little bit more about why I moved here, and I think why the rest of us moved here. It's because this island is completely different than Marco and Naples and Sanibel, and we came here for a reason. You know, people don't wear their wealth on their sleeve. People like the walkability. The comp plan talks a lot about, you know, pedestrian traffic and moving around. And I think the initial discussion we had that got us started with wanting to relook at the comp plan was to take nodes and insert some nodes, commercial nodes up and down the island to help spread out that walkability. And as I said at the beginning, you know, the floor area ratio and the density of the dwelling units per acre, all of that stuff was set in place to help with that vision. So we have to really question ourselves as to what we want the island to look like. You know, the big project that we all know about right now is Margaritaville, obviously. If you use that as a benchmark, if you use that as a visible tool, and think about what potentially changing the comp plan could do as far as adding massing, adding more density, as you have said, Councilor Veach, several times. I just want to, personally, I think it doesn't make sense to me to the plan that has been kind of shared with us that we've seen with the floor area ratio and the density. And when you do something, when you get rid of one thing, it has a very, very large effect on what this island is going to look like. I know that staff has told me that while we wanted to try to think of a way to entice developers to come, I think after the storm, we don't have to do that. They're already here. They're already buying up very large chunks of land, and they're doing it under the rules that are currently in place, knowing that there's an avenue they can go to ask for more density. I think if we make any major changes to that, we are going to put something in paper that is going to strap the councils and the LPA in the future. No problem. That I don't know that that's necessarily the right idea. At least personally, I don't believe that's the right idea. I think, and I can't obviously speak for everybody that's up at the table, but I'll speak for myself. You know, as I said, I moved here for a reason, because it's fun, it's funky, you never know who you're sitting next to, everybody helps each other. I think if we automatically allow more density without having the avenue that we already have in place, could be very, very detrimental and could very well change the island. We already know it's going to change. But do we want to, I know I'm being very long-winded here and I apologize, but do we want to make it so that, you know, if I get 10 floors, I have to do this? I don't know that that's necessarily the best path. I think being able to lay out, because what's important now may not be important 10 years from now or 5 years from now. So I think if we can have a discussion, and this is just my thoughts at the beginning, we'll certainly all talk about it, but if we can put out what's important to us now, like Vice Mayor has talked a lot about traffic mitigation. We've talked about parks, we've talked about workforce housing, all those things that are very important. I think working through that versus what a floor area ratio should be, what the max, you know, and I'm talking just specifically about commercial, you know, what the dwelling per units. I think we have to look at what we have on the island now, use a visual, and I don't mean to pick on Margaritaville, but it is definitely a building that we all see, and think about what those changes would make that building look like in today's world. And is that what we want to see? Is it the will of the decision makers that are sitting up here in the community to make it bigger or smaller or keep it the way it is? So that's kind of my 2 cents. Hopefully I didn't talk in circles too much, but with that, we'll open it up for Madam Chair, if you would like to say a few words.
See if, no, I think this microphone is, you're right, it's an honor. It didn't work half the time with you this morning. Dan, thank you so much. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for your comments. I agree with you. You know, I was just sitting outside with a friend of mine. Her name is Kelly. She's an artist. She's also a boat captain. She's 20 years younger than I am. And, you know, this hurricane has made folks, I mean, shoot, Jane and I were talking about it last night. You know, there's this part of us that want to, you know, cut bait and run. Go someplace else, find someplace else, because this is difficult. This path is super difficult. And Kelly, 20 years younger than I am, I mean, she and her husband are going to go and see if there is a greener pasture somewhere. I suspect she'll be back here. But one of the things she just said to me, it made me teary, because she said, you know, Anita, I came to Fort Myers Beach. You were a big part of why I'm here. We watched and watched, and we're trying to decide, because she's from Colorado. She's trying to decide where they were going to locate. They went to Sarasota. They thought that would be it. They went to Siesta Key. They thought that would be it. They went to Clearwater. They knew that wasn't it. And then they came to Fort Myers Beach, and I met them when they first came here, and they decided that this was the place for them because of every reason Dan just said, just illustrated. And one of the things she said to me, she said, I know the island's going to change, and people like to talk about Miami, but what could really happen to Fort Myers Beach is Clearwater. Nothing against Clearwater Beach. I mean, you know, I'm sure it's jam-packed right now, but I don't think that's what this community wants. What the LPA has talked about recently is, you know, giving our community a picture of what they can expect. And right now they have that picture. They don't think they do, but they really do, because our comp plan is in place. And I think that, for me at least, keeping this community on a personal scale, on a human scale, where, you know, maybe we have 3 or 4 story buildings, but 10, 12, 15, it's not Fort Myers Beach. I don't think it ever will be Fort Myers Beach. So I am trying to keep a very open mind about anything that's presented. I've been a party to some concepts that are coming forward from different developers, and I'm trying to keep an open mind, but I have to tell you, I instantly recoil with overdevelopment. It just makes me go, ah, no, but I try to keep an open mind. So I think what was presented to us here, there's some interesting information that I think is worthy of discussion, for sure. And I just think it would, the sooner that we can say with some certainty what our plan and what our vision is for the next 5, 10, 15 years, the sooner that we can tell our community that, the better off our residents and visitors will be, because they'll know what to expect. And right now, that uncertainty is so unsettling. The end.
I would just, kind of my point, and I agree that when I looked at some of the numbers on the on these modifications that happened, it was, it seemed to be an extraordinary leap of density. I will say though, my understanding is that we are obligated to revisit the comp plan periodically. That's kind of there's a state rule that something we have to do. It doesn't mean that this is necessarily what we have to do. The other thing is that as far as certainty, and I focus on this a lot as the CB zoning area, that was kind of frozen at what it was when the town was incorporated. As you said, what worked then maybe doesn't work now, but it's very restrictive. So if someone has office space without coming into the council for a variance, they get office space. They can't become a restaurant. They can't become retail. They can't become mixed use. A lot of things that now we would consider to be a benefit to our town, they can't do because of the way a code is. If we don't do modifications that implement that vision in the comp plan, then we're left with the piecemeal thing. Whenever someone wants to do something, they have to come in and get a specific variance package from a council, and depending on the council, whether that goes or doesn't. So I think, it's a good, useful exercise, but I don't think that necessarily means that the numbers that were presented to us are what we have to go with.
Okay. Like to say I agree with everything I've heard so far, but I'm a planner by training, by profession, so I look at technical issues, and I'm kind of getting stuck with what you guys are talking about, which is a vision and the technical issues. So a few things to point out, though, is as Councilman Veach presented, we have an obligation to update our comp plan. Comp plan is a living document that evolves over time. And we have existing conditions that are very different. Conditions have completely changed, so we need to be nimble and address those. I think the idea of staying human scale and giving the residents and the development community a clear idea of what we want to be moving forward is important. Another thing that's important is let's make sure we distinguish between, and it's unfortunate because our comp plan, and no comp plan is perfect, and I've been involved in writing comp plan policy, and over time it changes, and a lot of times you're like, they did the right thing to change it because we didn't foresee that when we wrote in the first place. So we're using density for even commercial uses and transient lodging. Very confusing to people. I think if we, as the consultant proposed, used FAR, which is a floor area ratio for commercial uses, lodging is a commercial use, it distinguishes it from residential density. I don't think this island has a residential density problem, a shortage of residential density. I think the idea is we need to address the commercial aspects, because rebuilding the commercial, which is needed, it's needed for the health of this island, for the tax base, that's going to be the hard part. It's going to be so expensive to build in a V zone or to drive flood-proof that we need to address that. Do we just need to grant more density for the sake of granting more units? I don't think so. I think any increase in density should be tied to providing the right form, providing the mixed use, providing the workforce housing. So let's distinguish between density and floor area and those transient lodging and commercial uses. I think that when it comes to those commercial uses, it's our responsibility to address it. We're not talking about throwing out the comp plan completely. We are looking at making changes. It's an evolution of what's there. We've got a very good base. We've got changing conditions. We're just trying to address those.
Well, I'm certainly not saying that we don't need to look at the comp plan. That was not my intention. My intention was, there's been a lot of things that have been thrown out there. Well, if you get rid of the dwelling per acre and just go with the floor area ratio, that still has a massing effect, as you well know. My only point was, and I think what Anita's point was as well, is that those numbers work. It doesn't mean that you can't come and ask for more. If you know that the town and its residents are looking for, as you said, dry flood proofing, something that is more resilient, mitigation, stuff like that, that you have a potential to then get more. But I don't want to just across the board erase something or give them something just out of the off. I think one, it's the fastest path to being rebuilt because it's already there. It gives people who have already purchased property to know what they have to look forward to. If we can give them clear, direct, what we're looking for, should you want more density? We all know we're going to have to go up on these buildings. We get that. But how high is high enough? How wide is wide enough? Those are the things I think that, and again, we're talking specifically about commercial right now. I think we have a whole nother discussion when it comes to pre-disaster build-back stuff. But I just think that that plan, those numbers that are there, meets the vision. I don't think the vision that was put in place at the time when the comp plan was written has changed all that much. The circumstances have changed, but I think the people that live here have that same vision, that same as small a town feel as you can make it. And that's more of what my conversation at the beginning was about, is not messing with the numbers. Maybe mess with some other things, how you can, create opportunity for somebody that wants to, I was going to sneeze, sorry, to do stuff. No.
I can just respond to that real quick.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly where staff is going to guide us in the discussion. So I think a lot of us are referring back to the PowerPoint and the stuff that was set forward by the Coordino group. At least from an LPA standpoint, I think we all agree that conceptually we like the idea of these nodes, the walkability, the 5-minute rule, the 5-minute walk type of thing, mix of uses. I think we all agreed also that the FARs presented in there and the densities presented in there were too high, that we all need to go back and look at that. The only thing I would say, though, is what you currently have in the comp plan and the LDC is the ability to ask for more units through this clause that says exceptional circumstances. And then you can ask for more height also. And there's discussion of height in the comp plan. And I've looked at those closely recently. And I agree with you. I think we need to start off with a base of what people can expect. And then they also, people have to know that if you're going to get more height or more lodging units or more residential units if you do a mixed use, these are going to be the things that you have to, you can have a menu of public benefits. And if you can pick 3 out of 10 or whatever, but I think that prevents the piecemeal approach, because there's certain things that we might be able to achieve as a town that if we do it piecemeal, so for example, creating wider sidewalks or promenades or things like that, where if every project comes in and we don't have a vision put in front of them and they do something a little different, we can lose that opportunity. So I think the idea is, I agree with you completely, of we have to set the tone and people have to understand what we want. One of the things that I did at the LPA, I came up with some examples of new urbanist developments elsewhere. And that kind of what we have in our comp plan currently is 3 to 4 stories is kind of that magic number. That's what feels human scale. It feels natural. But I think with the idea of if you go above that, then you have to provide the public benefit, and we can define what that is.
And I do think, Pat, that, there was that table that was presented to us where they kind of, it's not necessarily our priorities, but the idea of how that could work with the point system, just for that kind of thing. And as long as it's tight, right? As long as there isn't a loophole in there that someone can play. But I think that, in my mind, we already have these CB zoning districts where grew up organically along Estero Boulevard from demand over the years. And they were already pretty well placed. So I don't really see, one of the things that bother me in this plan is the expansion of some of those areas into residential areas. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's desired by people who live in the area or other people. So I think, there's some surgical things that could certainly be done that could add some certainty to these areas that were all destroyed. And if it works in that area, I don't see why it wouldn't work in the Times Square area.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple comments. Anita, the other day, in her wonderful therapeutic podcast, she challenged her listeners to, instead of griping about what you don't want, talk about what you do want. And so I gave that some thought, and I think that's much more productive, and I think it'll get us to where we need to get to a lot quicker. And as I look at, particularly on the commercial development side, I agree with the mayor in terms of the residential side. And I agree in part with Patrick on the commercial side, and there's other areas that I'm concerned about on the commercial side. I don't want to cede our ability to negotiate public benefit up front. This FAR equation right now cedes density to the developers with nothing in return for the island. And again, I see that not in an extortionist way, but in a partnership way. There's a lot of public benefits that we can ask for that are also beneficial to the commercial developer and to the guest experience, et cetera. So as I look at this, and as I look at commercial development, I want to make sure the comp plan is flexible enough. I know we've got concern about height, but there may be instances where height makes sense. Anita used to talk about, she'd hold up her piece of paper. Sometimes on the beach, this is better than this because you have more view corridor, you have spots for pocket parks, you've got all kinds of opportunities. So as I as I look at what do I want as an individual counselor, my first thing is when a commercial development comes before the council, my first request is do no harm. Traffic mitigation, to me, traffic congestion is the number one, aside from the occasional red tide nightmare that we experience, and those issues are being addressed long term. The traffic congestion issue is the number one quality of life adverse impactor. And so I want to make sure the commercial development does no harm to that, because they're going to be asking for additional density, and I understand why they will to make the economic model work. So in return for additional density, I've talked about this a lot. I'd like to see pedestrian overpasses. Allow the traffic to flow. We could put up pedestrian guardrails to channel people to the overpasses. They won't be used in all occasion, but we can certainly put them in areas where there's a lot of intensity and a lot of opportunities to slow down traffic on Estero Boulevard. This concept of there's nothing we can do about the traffic, I just won't have it. There's things we can do about it. Can we solve all of it? Will each solution solve the whole problem? No, but it'll take a bite out of it. For example, I'd like to see pedestrian overpasses at Red Coconut. I'd like to see one at Beach Baptist Church. That may seem odd to you. Well, they don't have property across the street, but there is a beach access across the street from Beach Baptist. They're going to have a proposal coming forth at some point that will have a significant public benefit. We'll have a very animated debate around this, but there's an opportunity for another pedestrian crosswalk. Lani Kai is an interesting location for a pedestrian overpass. A second one from Margaritaville over to Times Square, where we can allow this traffic to continue to flow. Again, we also have beach accesses up and down the island where in certain instances it makes sense to have a pedestrian overpass depending upon the commercial development opportunity. If you're on the bay side, how could I contribute to public benefit? I can't do an overpass over Estero. Well, you sure could contribute to a water ferry system that goes to all the marinas up and down the island and potentially across the way to San Carlos and even further up into Lee County, wherever it makes sense. That could be a huge impact in terms of transportation and also congestion mitigation. Workforce housing. Again, workforce housing is such a nebulous term, but there are situations where the full-time employees of a particular commercial establishment, particularly a hotel, The developers is advantaged by having their workforce housing on site, 24 hours a day, on location. They're not driving here from an hour and a half away where they're getting into traffic. They know they're going to be at work. There's an advantage to that. Plus, it's an employee retention advantage, all kinds of advantages, which we've talked about. Is there a shuttle? Should they offer a shuttle to the airport to reduce the need to rent a car? Is there bike rental? Is it free bike rental for their guests to encourage people just to not need a car while they're here? Most of that commercial district will be walkable. And maybe there's a situation if they're on Estero Boulevard, but there's not a pedestrian overpass, maybe they cede some of that land in front of their property to the town, to the right-of-way, to increase the width of the sidewalks and the width of the bike path, and particularly on the north end where things are narrower. My point is these are asks that are a public benefit that benefit everyone. And if we cede that negotiating leverage through an FAR formula that's not friendly to the town, we basically throw up the red flag before we even get started. So for me, and there's a lot of other issues that we need to be thinking about in terms of redevelopment, but this traffic congestion mitigation piece has to be extremely key part of the puzzle. Thanks.
And just to summarize, one point I totally agree on, Jim, is that I don't think we should be giving away more density by right in this modification.
You know, and I think, Vice Mayor Adderholt, you kind of explained it a little more in depth of exactly why I said what I said at the beginning. There are so many ways through traffic mitigation, through water, everything that you just mentioned, to use a point system or to put something and make it even more complicated than it needs to be doesn't make sense to me. You know, I'm not a developer. I don't know what makes sense to me if I'm developing a piece of property. What I'm trying to get to is you've been very adamant about traffic mitigation is something that is one hot button for you that I think, as you rightly said, is very beneficial to the entire community. There are several other things, I'm sure, as we hear from the other members here, on what's important. I think keeping it open-ended challenges the developers to think outside the box and come to us with ideas. We maybe won't think of everything. The next council may not think of everything. The LPA may not think of everything. But these people that are developing these commercial properties do this for a living. They know the bottom dollar. They're buying them right now without any changes already. They probably have grandiose plans. But I think we need to give them a specific direction of 5 to 10, however many areas that are important to a complete community benefit. And I think that will help give direction. It will speed up our recovery and our build back much faster. But we need to be very distinct. We need to be very matter of fact before we leave this room. This is what we're going to do moving forward. This is what you can expect. If you're coming in to ask for something more, these are the 5, 10, 15, whatever areas that are very important to this community. So put your thinking caps on, figure it out amongst your development people, and come speak to us.
You know, I'm having this this moment here, and I'm just going to say it. So, the mantra of Incorporation was preservation is progress. Do you remember that, Judy? Preservation is progress. And now here we are, however many umpteen years later, lifetimes later, especially since September 28th, and it's exactly what we're talking about. We want to preserve our quality of life. We want to preserve our small town character. We want to preserve our community. And I have goosebumps when I say it, but you know, once again, it's our mantra.
I think before we move on too far down the road, I'd like to hear, you know, based on what we've said already, if we can just kind of go around and get some input from everybody that's here as to how they feel about what has been said so far. Maybe then we can put at least that part of it to rest and move on to the next part of the discussion.
Well, thanks. I've lived in Longboat Key. I've lived in Sarasota. Lived on Siesta Key, and when we came down here quite a while ago, I liked Fort Myers Beach because I like being around regular folks. You know, like my guy across the street's a carpenter. When I lived on Longboat Key, nobody that lived there, you know, there wasn't anybody. If you needed somebody to come work on your house, they came from Sarasota someplace. It wasn't like a real community, like a small town like Fort Myers Beach is. And I think we shouldn't try to be, I saw some of the exhibits that were put out by the planner. You know, like here's what they did at Clearwater, here's what they did at St. Pete or some other places. I don't think we should look at it that way. I think we ought to define our own aesthetic and be, you know, Sanibel, I think, is unique, and they've taken a very strong stand on environmental issues and so forth, and they maintain that pretty well. But I think Fort Myers Beach, I think we ought to look for what makes us unique, and let's not try to be like other people. Let's just try to be like Anita says. What fits this community, what makes it unique, I think we ought to stay to that.
Well, I think the number one thing that my biggest takeaway from our meeting last month was the nodes. I think we have to agree to do that, because being a resident mid-island, I think it would be fantastic to be able to walk, bike to different areas. I think that's key. Now, as Bill said, you know, there's a couple streets we probably need to take out, but I think we can all figure out where to put these things. But I think the node deal is, for the future of this island, is going to be fantastic. As far as density, you know, my wife and I own a property, and the way the code's written right now, we're probably not going to be able to build back. It just doesn't make economic sense. The Sea Gypsy, yes. I mean, we have a small parcel without some, you know, far improvement. There's no way. It just doesn't make sense to build back 4 units on our little property, just economically. And I don't want to see, I mean, so maybe I'm a little bit selfish, but there are other people in my shoes that with these small parcels, we need to give them some type of incentive to build back. Now, I've had a discussion with other developers. I don't want to, if somebody's a big developer and buys a huge parcel, I don't want to penalize them, but there's got to be some kickstart or something for people with those small properties, because I don't want to see this island look like it did until Margaritaville built their place. I don't want to see empty lots for 17 years. So I think we need to make a decision, and so everybody understands what we're playing with, and go forward. But we need to do it fast, and you know, get this island rebuilt. But I still want the small time charm just like everyone else.
I've already talked, so I'll pass.
So we owned a house on Anna Maria Island for 10 years and ended up selling it for a couple of reasons. One, it was too cold for me in the winter. Sorry, it's at that rock into the Gulf Stream. It got down to 30 too many times. But also, that was on the other end of the spectrum. For me, it was too sleepy. So when we looked around, and believe me, we looked at every non-state tax state when we were looking at retirement, and we always ended up on Fort Myers Beach every time. And it was because of the vibrancy, at the same time, the quaintness, the family, the beautiful beaches, all of that. So in order to maintain that, you know, I personally don't want to see the huge big developments come into play. At the same time, you know, what Scott just said, if we don't allow our smaller businesses the ability to rebuild, then we're going to lose that quaintness. We're going to lose that charm. So there's got to be a balance in there somewhere of, you know, not giving it away. I love the idea of the incentives, and I loved everything that Jim said about that. I would also add the school, some kind of school incentive to keep us a community, to keep that school prospering. But I think there has to be a balance, and I don't think it's going to take a whole revision of a comp plan to do that. I think there's bits and pieces we can look at, and we can make it maybe in a step pattern. Residential could be one, small business, and then, you know, luxury community or luxury bills or whatever it may be.
but I think there could be different steps in there.
Well, I have talked a lot, but I'm going to talk a little bit more. I agree. I don't know that there's a way, and I keep going back to what you were saying, Scott, the small properties. Obviously, I don't know that there's a way that you can increase the FAR or the dwellings, or I don't know if there's a way that you can do that without doing it across the board. And I keep thinking back to one of the items that you guys at the LPA discussed that came before us, and it changed my mind based on what Chair Saracita said, and that was those small cluster houses on the north end of the island.
I'm just writing that down.
So it made me think about that, and this discussion is similar to that. We provided them, through the LPA and the council, provided an avenue for them to build back at least what they had, which they couldn't do before. And they still have an avenue to be able to go up in the air should they want to come before the council or come before the LPA and do the process. This, to me, is the same thing, and the Sea Gypsy is the same thing. If there's a way that we can at least allow, now, obviously, and we'll just use the Sea Gypsy because that's what, you brought it up, that the ask or the benefit that you could provide is going to be much different than someone who owns 5 acres, right? I mean, they're gonna ask for much more. And what are those smaller projects like that look like? I mean, I know that, for instance, you had was a first school, right? And how do you, or library? How do you incorporate a bookstore or something into your property to allow you to go up? I mean, so I think there's ways that you can put your hat on, you can get creative, you can talk to people, and you can figure it out. I don't think, and I'll just keep saying it, I don't think changing the FAR or the dwelling units per acre on commercial would create a much bigger mess than trying to work with smaller boutique places like the Sea Gypsy and other places on the island that want to stay, because that is part of our culture. And I think just the fact that it was part of our culture and it is a benefit to the community in itself, just by building back, even if it's a little bit bigger. The fact that the Sea Gypsy would be back, it's just going to look a little bit different, it's going to a little bit bigger. That means that one of the businesses that was here before stayed here. That's a benefit to the community in my eyes. So I just wanted to say that, just to kind of give some thought into how to be able to think outside the box and be creative on what is a community benefit. And I think we can all agree, if we could have every business back on the island that was here before the storm, would be a huge benefit to the island as a whole. But I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I was going to resist as well, but I can't help myself. I just two quick things. I think the current comp plan, as long as it gives us the flexibility, we've talked about, we've got to streamline and standardize. Well, one of the beauties of Fort Myers Beach is it is eclectic, and everybody uses that term to describe their love for Fort Myers Beach. A lot of folks I talk to, they love the eclectic nature. So if we give ourselves some flexibility through a variance or a special exception or a new CPD filing, to give a very creative developer who's willing to offer significant public benefit to the community, whether it be traffic mitigation, for example, and I shouldn't get too far into the Beach Baptist Church dynamic, but it's a very unique model, and that it'll be a not-for-profit, and they're interested in some high-end condos, the sale of which will offset some workforce housing that would be targeted specifically towards families who then would have families that would have kids at the beach school, potentially 15 kids. You think about our enrollment goals, that's a big chunk of our enrollment goals. If we could have some housing that could encourage workforce housing that would have families, not just workers, but families that would have elementary school kids. It's just an interesting dynamic. We need to leave ourselves the flexibility to be nimble enough to negotiate density trade-offs with entities that can demonstrate significant public benefit. I just don't want to tie our hands to that. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with case by case, because each case is going to be different. Each developer or redeveloper will be different. And we ought to discuss those cases. We ought to have some broad goals, obviously, that is sort of the underpinning, but giving ourselves some flexibility to look at, there are certain instances, I'll tell you, that will make sense to go higher as opposed to wider. And certainly won't be all the time, and it certainly has any desire to have this be like Miami, but we need to be flexible for when the interesting ideas come along to consider them on a case-by-case basis. That's all I've got. Thanks.
I'll just say, I'm sorry. I think I'll just say that Councilor Woodson expressed a lot for what I was thinking of. I'm hearing a need for a delicate balance, and Vice Mayor has always done a great job again of championing the traffic flow situation. As somebody that's at the extreme south end of the island, you can't get any further south than where I live. I always dreaded going north, even if I took the shuttle. It was just seemed to just drag and drag and drag. So those are two big points for me.
I think it's very idealistic to think that we're going to have carpenters and plumbers and all that in our neighborhood anymore, because unless they lived here previously, they probably won't be able to afford to buy something, or if they lost their house, to rebuild it if they're still working. So I think that person is going to be outpriced on this island, unfortunately. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the 50% rule is so important, because there are people who are still working and living in their houses here that can afford to stay if they can fix their houses. And I think that's an element that is important to this community, because a lot of them have been here a long time. I do feel that there is a benefit, and I've always been a big component of if there are numbers of units that would be allowed for this box on this piece of parcel, that I don't have a problem with it going this way as opposed to this way, because it does give view corridor, it gives air, it gives light, it gives everything. And I hate to make our box always be like this, because then it'll always be like this next door. And I think the benefit truly of adding height and things like that would be to add workforce, and that to what will be the lower part as opposed to the upper part of any building that somebody would be building. But that is the idea of having workforce housing back on the beach. They will never live here again. The housekeepers, the bartenders, the waitresses, they can't afford to live here, not even in a garage. That just will not happen. The small businesses that have little hotels or little, since we've talked about Scott's property, that's another one that they had so many legal units. They can't go this way. They can't fit them back on the property. They would need to go this way to survive. It's an option we should consider. I just think that people who are buying properties on this island today, whether they're buying homes that need to be renovated or buying them to tear down to make their mega houses, are not going to rebuild a cute little cottage with a front porch, which is what our comp plan designs are for our design standards. And so we do have to take a look at that. I don't think anybody would put the money into a nice little 1,200 square foot cottage or 672 square foot cottage, which is what a lot of them are. But the fact that these people in these cottage homes or cottage lots can rebuild their property at that may make it affordable for them to do it, because they could, because they're not building layers and all that, because each floor costs more, we're giving them the opportunity to come back and stay. Whereas the answer would just be no if we didn't open up the cottage lots. So I think it's really important to think about the people who are here and who have lost and who want to still be here. And the question should be, how can I help you? How can I get you back in your home? How can we get you back on the island? Because everybody's gone. I mean, I didn't send out Christmas cards this year because I don't know where anybody is. And it crushes me. I am so depressed right now. It's really hard for me to visualize a whole new place. And that's kind of what it's going to be if we don't realize that there are people here that need to come back. There are people here that need to stay, and we need to be asking the question, how can I help you? Instead of, nope, no, 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 we need more information, more this, more that, rejection, rejection, rejection. We need to say, let me help you get this done. And that's my thing.
So, yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said today. I think it's refreshing to hear our council and our LPA all speaking generally the same language. So that's super encouraging. 43 years ago, my parents took me to Sanibel Island. 42 years ago, they brought me to Fort Myers Beach. And I've been coming here every year since. I've lived here full-time 7 years with my wife. It's part of our family. I firmly believe that anything we can do to preserve what we had, anything we can do to encourage affordable vacationing for families. We were a blue-collar family from Indiana. I have lifelong friends that we met here on Fort Myers Beach. We were all blue-collar families. So anything we can do to preserve that, I firmly believe that if you own property on this island before, and I don't care if it was 30 feet wide, I don't care if it was the Sea Gypsy Inn or Mom's or what have you, I wish there was a way we could figure out that if someone wanted to build back, we could get out of their way and let them do it. Because I think today it seems like, as Jane mentioned, we are in their way. And so back to what Council woman Woodson said, there's a need for balance. And I think if we can find out how to, a comp plan has to be looked at, obviously. There needs to be some tweaks, some changes. But to the extent we can preserve, to the extent we can allow people to rebuild, and we can focus and get behind 75 to 85% of the people, man, we can see movement. Because right now, there's not much movement. I mean, we're getting a few permits, but we really don't have the plan. And so I think it's great we're here today. Again, very encouraged that we're all speaking the same language. That's super refreshing to me, because I've been concerned about it. We're a couple of those people that said maybe packing up and leaving is the right thing, and maybe there's another place. I don't think there's another place, and I've said it to my wife in the last 5 days multiple times. I don't think there's another place I can be as happy as I've been in Fort Myers Beach. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you. I echo your words. I haven't heard anything here that I disagree with. Just to qualify a little bit my discussion is, I'm looking at this from a technical standpoint, just because I get in the weeds of what a comp plan is, what the Land Development Code does. But I heard what Dan said, Jim, what you said with regards to our current comp plan. I agree with you guys. I think there's ways, little easy tweaks that we can get there. For example, other communities have a base density and a max density. And you just know going in that unless you provide public benefit, you're not going to get to the max. But it's clearly defined. Here's your base, what you can get by right, and here's your max. Same thing with the FARs that we have today. I think the FARs would work for almost every project that might be coming forward. We might just want to maybe make little adjustments that if they provide public benefit, then there's that room. And part of the issue is right now, the way it's written, it's a little nebulous. Yeah.
You're the guy to, and it's always helpful. We're living in this world. Would you just give a little thumbnail lesson as to what an FAR is, what we're talking about, what's been proposed by staff? Just spend a couple minutes just so the public has some clue what we're even talking about, because it's a relatively new term to myself, quite honestly.
Okay, FAR stands for floor area ratio. And I'll give you a simple example. Let's say you have a 1 acre lot. 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. Okay, If you have a floor area ratio of 1, it means you could build 560 square feet on that lot. If you build 1 story, you cover the entire lot. If you build 2 stories, half of that amount on each floor. So the ratio is, it gives you a total square footage that is guaranteed, that you know you can have. The way you configure it on your lot is based on conditions of the lot, the amount of parking you need to provide, water management, if it makes sense to provide view corridors, if it makes sense to provide beach access, all these different things. But the FAR gives you the maximum square footage that you can build on your lot. So currently, for most of the island, a 1.2 is the standard FAR. You're allowed to go to 1.5 when you ask for it. Anything above 1.5 would require a comp plan amendment. So I think, like I said, I think
It requires a comp plan amendment. You can't get that through a variance or a special exception or a CPD, or you could.
you could not.
So
Above
just-
1.5,
So we've
you
capped
could
any,
not.
any creative opportunity above that number.
Yes. And I don't know what the right number is above 1.5, but I'm just saying there might be an opportunity to explore that. Do we want to bump that number up slightly? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
And I apologize because this is actually B on the agenda, so we hadn't planned for this discussion early on. Perfectly fine. I've taken a lot of really good information from this. So actually, right now, the way it is set up, the future land use districts that are over the downtown and over Santini Plaza, those allow actually up to a 2.5 FAR. The difference is the zoning districts that enable those future land use districts don't. If you request a CPD, a commercial plan development, you can ask for more, but when you ask for more, you have to provide those public benefits. So, that's more view corridor, that's beach access, that's the things you're asking for and you've been talking about. But it's important to know that right now our comp plan does allow that in the downtown and in Santini, up to 2.5. Just people don't get it because you have to offer a lot in order to get that. And we're not saying with these comp plan changes, we're not recommending that you give a lot up front. We're saying that essentially kind of where we're at right now is right. Mm-hmm. But if you want to give more, if you want to get more, if you want to say, I have an acre and I want more than, twice the floor area ratio of your lot. So 2 acres of development on a 1 acre lot. The way you can get that is by providing the things that the town wants. And that's in design, that's in right-of-way, that's in greater setbacks, and saying, so if it's on the beach side and you have a lot that would have a beautiful view from Estero, maybe the thing that the city wants, the town wants, is big setbacks on the side. So they do the right design. They say, we really want this 2.0 or this 2.5. They give these gigantic setbacks. They do a beautiful design. And this is all negotiation. The example that Jason gave you, or put in the agenda packet, is, it's on a number system so that it says, a view corridor is worth 5 points, a right-of-way is worth 5 points. It gives it a point value, but you don't have to do it that way. It can be an open negotiation, similar to how we do CPDs right now. We're just giving them a higher cap so you can get more. So if somebody were to come forward and say, I want to give you 50 feet of right-of-way, I want to give you a new beach access, I want to give you great big side setbacks, I want to give you a park, and they're giving you a design that you're comfortable with, can you give them that additional? And right now, the way the comp plan is written, you're capped. You're capped where it says you are. So the only places they could get those are the areas that are zoned downtown and the area that's where Santini Plaza is. But what we're saying is maybe that should be applied in more places so that, and not what we're saying, what the comprehensive plan consultant is recommending is maybe you should provide that option to go up in more places, and it's not a by right. It's through negotiation that you get there. The by right would remain in the similar range where we're at now. But if they said, no, we really need more, if we want to come back, we really have to have more, then we have to figure out how they get there, you know, working through that process, you know, with the council, with the LPA, with the applicant. Sorry, I I wanted to say that the 2.5 is currently the limit in those two areas. Just the enabling zoning doesn't get you there.
So that kind of brings me back to the beginning, and the question I was trying to ask. Is that what the will of all the people sitting up here and the residents want to see? Do we want to see someone have the ability in these areas to go double what they can do now? I personally don't.
But it would only be through working with you. So if you said no,
I get that, but do we want to open that door? Do we want to, as a community, open that door for that potential? Because this community, this council, this LPA may not be in favor of it now, but if you open that door, the next one down the line or the one after that may allow something that this one wouldn't. So I'm trying to get to the point that I personally don't think, I really would like to focus on what Scott said, those nodes, because that was what the whole driver was at the beginning of bringing on that group, was to spread out that commercial activity to make the walkable, bikeable, you know, however you're getting around, make that island spread it out, which ultimately would help with the traffic mitigation, things like that. So I really think it's important to focus on those nodes. How would, if this is all done through zoning, what are those nodes zoning going to be? What are we going to set that at? How high do we want to go? You know, I think if we focus on those and not mess what's already there, that would be a much more productive use of time, in my opinion. And I don't want to speak for anybody else here, but I think what we have in place sets that minimum and maximum that you were talking to without changing anything. But the nodes that we all have talked about that we want to add throughout the island, depending on where those end up, what is that going to look like? What is that zoning going to dictate that they can do there? That, to me, is what I think the comp plan conversation should be.
But what about Sarah's point? We have a really good group here and very responsible group. Why would we deny ourselves the opportunity to at least hear the pitch? Maybe you've got a redeveloper who has extremely clever idea that has significant public benefit that's very unique. Why would we deny them the opportunity to at least make the pitch and offer that public benefit? It may not be something anybody in this room would like, but it seems like we're limiting our possibilities. But I'm just thinking out loud. It's a great philosophical conversation.
Well, I would just let me interject a little bit what Jim said. Right now, what we have is, especially in the commercial the boulevard zoning district, is extremely restrictive. It pretty much means that anybody who wants to rebuild, even the one who came in the other day with the work live, would have to come in front of council and ask for a variance for every single one of those. So I'm like probably most of you, I don't agree with some of the numbers that are thrown around. I just think, you know, putting an FIR of 5.0 as a possibility to anybody seems to be very extreme. But coming up with our packages for these small places like the Sea Gypsy to say, maybe if you have a series of incentives that encourage things like different types of housing, commercial, whatever else, maybe there's a different plan besides a hotel that they may be interested in, or maybe it increases the value of their house if somebody else takes that up. But the idea is coming up with a template for what we see as that vision just for these little areas that are already commercial without expanding them, in my mind. It should mean that there's just less people who come in for variances because the package already provides a pathway for them to do something.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think if we can look at what the comp plan says currently for some of the things like you're talking about and open those doors, I think that solves what I'm trying to say. I think it adds to what I think you were saying, Vice Mayor Adderholt, about it opens up ideas and visions of areas that they couldn't do it before. We're not just, Pat said it earlier, he thinks that the numbers that are currently in place will work for most of the developments that I know that you're probably seeing. So don't change that, but I'm fully behind doing what you're saying. Take a look at some of this commercial boulevard stuff. Take a look at other areas, including these new nodes. How can we improve the ability for the people within that to do something other than a bank? Yeah. Or if they don't want to do the Sea Gypsy again, or if they don't want to do a breakfast place, or whatever it is, how do we get how do we make those changes that help keep the island the way it is, but maybe changes it or tweaks it a little bit? I don't know that going up to those bigger numbers,
You know, if I can maybe offer something up is, it's going to be hard to not get into the weeds on some of those issues to be able to address them. Okay, I'll give you a perfect example. Times Square, we've got a height limit, and what's kind of funky with the way we're set up on Fort Myers Beach is you have to meet a floor limitation and an FAR limitation. And most places you're going to have either one of them, or you've got the option of either using either the FAR or the floor limitation. But we've got things written in a certain way where you can measure your height from base flood elevation, and you could technically fit 3 stories in there, but you've got to count your ground level as a story, so you can never maximize your height because you can only put 1 story in there. So if you've got, so I'll give you an example. If you have 30-foot height measured from base flood elevation, okay, you could fit potentially 3 stories within that 30 feet, okay? Right now, the way we've got it written is if you put anything underneath, including parking, that's a floor. So within your 30 feet, you can only put 2 floors, okay? So that's wasted space. So it's a conflict in the way it's written. I'm not saying necessarily grant more stories to people. I'm just saying we have a bunch of these little things that are technically conflicting in the comp plan and the LDC. So I think we're going to have to get there. We're going to have to get in the weeds to address those. Okay. So that was one comment, because I agree. I think generally speaking, where we are as a comp plan, you can redevelop with a lot of those existing requirements. I think we need to clarify them. People need to understand. When we're talking FAR, also, are we talking total FAR, including parking underneath, or just either the commercial space or the habitable space? So those are things that are not clearly defined. People have to understand what it is we're talking about. So that's one issue. The other thing, and that's to address the Vice Mayor's comments about this negotiation. I completely agree with you. We need that flexibility and that leeway. I think we have that through the plan development process. One of the things that maybe I'd like our town attorney to comment on is what I've seen in other jurisdictions is, unless you define what these public benefits are, what you want, and I don't think it has to be a point system. It could just be, as a council, these are the benefits we want to see, and this is kind of a ranking of what we think is more important. What that does is it avoids a problem of a year down the line, a property owner doesn't get what he wants. And now he points to the other project, says, they got this, and they only gave this or this. And now you have to have some kind of a rational nexus to be able to tell people, yes, we granted more density or more height because they were consistent with what we've put out there of these are the public benefits we want to see. If we don't even put that out there, we run the risk of getting ourselves in trouble down the line. And that maybe the town attorney can comment on that.
In any regulation, and certainly with respect to the Land Development Code, you want to have, as much as possible, within reason, some guidelines or standards to apply to any particular situation when granting a discretionary approval, which is what we're talking about. The best example I can give that many of you lived through and have dealt with, again, is the Margaritaville project. And I don't know the exact language off the top of my head, but there's language in our land development code when dealing with projects of that nature that give the ability to the town council to give essentially what's being discussed here as development bonuses, and that's ultimately what led to the approval of what is currently Margaritaville. When that approval was granted, the resident who challenged that matter in court made the argument that the language in the code that was applied by the town was too amorphous and gave unbridled discretion and had no guidelines. Ultimately, the Second District Court of Appeal ruled that no, it did, and that the town council did not, and this community did not apply those standards improperly. Certainly, if you want to avoid that type of litigation going forward, then you want to ultimately look at putting more definitive standards as opposed to it's in the best interest type of language. But at the same time, I will tell you, and it would be my recommendation, you still give yourself some wiggle room to provide for that discretionary review. Maybe not to the degree that the current language reads, and to define it more precisely. Certainly, I think that's something that you should look at. But it doesn't have to be, if you do this, this, and this, you automatically get this and this and this bonus. You can do that, but if you want to give yourself some wiggle room, you don't want to have necessarily a direct correlation between, if you do this, we're going to automatically give you that. Did that answer your question?
While you're there, could I just ask you a couple of questions?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, Dan hit on, I was writing it down as he was saying it. Would there be, and talking about technical things like Patrick is illustrating, would there be some maneuver that the council, LPA and or council or whatever combination it would be, to create something much like we did for the cottage lots in the residential category, to do something with the smaller commercial properties on the commercial end, because the comp plan modifications are going to take years to accomplish. And so, I mean, folks I've been talking to tell me their best guess is 2.5 to 3 years. And because of all the cycles it would have to go through and everything. So if you were standing on the sidelines, let's say Scott and Jackie were standing on the sidelines thinking, ooh, instead of, if we were all on a different page saying, you know what, we're going to increase the FAR to 4, then Scott and Jackie would be saying, hey, great, there's life for the Sea Gypsy. But if we're not saying that, is there something that we could do, that we could implement, that could be immediate or in effect sometime soon, to not have, as Scott said, an empty island for 5 years, to implement, like we did with the cottage lots, for residential properties that would then keep this community in a multi-level, like Scott said, can that middle-class family from Indiana still afford to vacation on Fort Myers Beach?
The answer to that is yes, you
Okay,
can. I don't think that the process of adopting your comprehensive plan and
Take that
implementing will take that long. I certainly have had conversations internally with staff that let's try and expedite this. This is the opportunity. This is the time in which to take something that normally is a longer drawn out process, expedite it, because for lack of a better description, you all have a blank canvas.
Yeah.
To paint what you want Fort Myers Beach to be, in my opinion, and that comprehensive plan should be will be that document moving forward. So the sooner that we can get the comprehensive plan in place to reflect what this council and this community wants, then the sooner then we can take advantage of that new comprehensive plan and then move on to changing the land development code. In the meantime, if that is or some of these directions the council wants to go in, then we as staff, you need to direct us to take a look at the existing comprehensive plan, because we still have to stay consistent with that document internally with whatever changes we make to our land development code, to make sure that we can do some of those things to give more immediate relief.
Okay, second question. Is the variance or special exception criteria editable?
Yes, it is. But particularly with respect to what I would call more the variance criteria, that criteria has been litigated extensively throughout the state of Florida. And what you all have in your current iteration of your variance criteria is really the standard that the courts have said this is the type of criteria you need to apply, and so you're in line with the case law as it currently exists. You can modify it. You can give it some different language to maybe loosen it up, to use that word, but it's the variance criteria that has been loosened where the courts have said that's generally not what you should be doing. So,
Okay, thank you.
anything else? I thought by sitting over the little kids table, we wouldn't be called upon. But
If I could
yes,
just, quickly
Patrick.
point something out, and I think you guys can
Mr.
confirm
Reyes.
this. When it comes to smaller mom and pop hotels, motels, helping Scott, for example, and a project like that, we can do it pretty quickly because right now the determining factor is that conversion ratio that is within the LDC.
Correct.
And I think by just doing a quick LDC amendment, we could address it. So I don't think it would necessarily need.
What do you mean? I'm just that you just made a light bulb come up. But what? Remind me about that, Patrick.
There's a brief recitation in the comprehensive plan that says that the land development code should create a conversion criteria for residential to hotel units.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily specify in the comprehensive plan the number that's in the land development code. I think it's, where is she? Oh, or maybe you know it off the top of your head what the conversion is.
Conversion varies from a 1-to-1 to up to 3, based on the size of the units. But almost every other jurisdiction, either you have an FAR that you're limited to, or you have a total number of transient units you can ask per acre. Well, we've got this, again, funky kind of way of doing it on Fort Myers Beach, where you start off with residential density, you apply the multiplier, and then you end up with how many transient lodging units you can have. I don't like the system, but what is really good with that now is we can change that quickly and help the mom and pops without needing a comp plan amendment.
And yes, that is a fairly true statement. What I will caution both the council and the LPA about on this issue, having dealt with it in other coastal communities, is when you start getting into the conversion issue of residential to hotel units, where it impacts you, and we generally don't give this much thought, is that the state mandate that coastal high hazard areas be able to be evacuated within 24 hours.
Yeah.
So those hotel units are considered for purpose of evacuation residential units for the most part. And so you have to account for their removal off the island in the event of a tropical storm to meet the 24-hour evacuation period. Some jurisdictions in similar coastal communities to Fort Myers Beach have a requirement that the hotels evacuate earlier so they can meet the 24-hour standard. And again, so we would have to, that's something, I don't think it significantly impacts the community, but I mention it because I just don't know the numbers and how close the area is to meeting the 24-hour evacuation standard.
Thanks,
Anything
John.
else?
I'm sure there will be. Just not right this second. I want to apologize to Keith and staff. I know I got a little overzealous at the beginning and skipped right over the first agenda item. We will get back to it. I apologize. I know I got a little excited at the beginning. That's why I don't drink coffee.
We got one more down there.
Yeah, we haven't heard from Jim yet. I wanted
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like to thank the council for accommodating the LPA today and letting us hear your vision. I think it's beneficial for all of us. I heard a lot of comments about balance and flexibility and maintaining the island the way it was. I think I hear a consensus that we all want to preserve the things the way they were as much as possible, and I concur with that. In order to do that, though, I do think that we, as the LPA and as the council, need the flexibility to negotiate with developers. And in the packet today, there's density and bonus point systems from other jurisdictions. I would be concerned that if that type of arrangement was adopted, it locks the council in. The developer then has a right to say, I've done this, I'm entitled to these points. And that takes away some of the flexibility that I think the council needs in order to get the beach back to the way it was. To avoid being arbitrary, I would agree that you need to establish what you think are the incentives that are important, and that goes a long way to avoiding a lawsuit where someone's saying you were arbitrary and capricious. You can point to a document that said that these were our priorities, and the developer was willing to give A, B, and C, and we gave D instead. But you don't want to lock yourself into a position where you lose your flexibility. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So I want to try to sum up what we've talked about just to see if we're kind of all in agreement of what I think I've been hearing so far. Is I think we've kind of come to a consensus that the floor area ratio and the density that is in place within the comp plan now makes sense with what is potentially coming. It still allows room for negotiation. I think that's one part. The other part was I think we need to direct staff, or we need to work through the LPA and the council to direct staff as to what are the priorities, what are the things as a broader spectrum, not necessarily if this then that, but a broader spectrum that is a community benefit, so that it is laid out for developers and they understand these are the 5 things that are very important, and let them choose what is, I've said this scenario a couple times. Maybe developer A has a buddy who owns a trolley, and he can get a good deal on trolleys and donate them to the town, and let them decide what it makes the most sense out of the 5, 10, whatever it is, needs that the town community is looking for. I think it also heard it's important to move forward with the nodes that we've been talking about. Sorry, I'm trying to look both ways. The nodes that we had talked about throughout the island, get a better understanding of where they're going to be, what that zoning is going to be, what intensity, density is going to be involved within those zones to help give a better picture to potential developers, multi-use type stuff. Find a way through the either LDC or possibly some small comp plan adjustments to allow the mom and pops like the Sea Gypsy to be able to build something back that makes financial sense for them and preserves some of the cottage type stuff we had in the small business feel before the storm. So those are kind of the 4 top things I think I've heard out of the conversation so far. If I've missed something, please let me know. But I think that's kind of the gist of where it sounds like we want to go with discussions through the LDC, through the land, LPA and the council.
And I would just point out that, a lot of that, even though everybody was pretty shocked by the numbers that came up, I think that the basic core idea they're talking about is still valid, because they've just taken the CB zoning districts, essentially expanded them and moved them into, and named them depending on where they were on the island. I think we could also just go back to adjusting what we do with the CB zoning district. How do we take that, which is already in place, and give those people who own that space some clarity on what they can do going forward? And that may be as simple as going into the to the town codes to where we're defining the CB zoning district and cleaning that up.
Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
I think Patrick had brought something up quickly. I don't know if everybody caught it, but how are we going to determine where the FAR starts? Is it on the ground or is it above base flood?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that back up. There's been a lot of conversation I've heard from people in the community, pros and cons to each. I think this could be another fairly simple adjustment to, I don't necessarily think that this is my opinion, I don't think we necessarily have to adjust from base flood elevation, but potentially you could get more height above what we currently have, 30 feet, whatever it is, again, based on some of this criteria that we've talked about, to be able to allow someone to maybe go another story if they want. But I don't know that I'd be in favor of changing it from base flood elevation to the beginning of the first floor.
One thing when Patrick was talking when he was talking about that, even if you put parking on the ground floor, that you can lose that floor if we counter to the floor. The one thing that came to me is I know there's been a lot of talk about trying to get people to not put anything down on the ground floor for a number of reasons. One is debris, one is sight line. That maybe this is an incentive that you be limited, saying, okay, you can put parking maybe on the ground floor, but if you close in any of the ground floor, that's a floor. And then to encourage people if they want more height. I know this is kind of a thing in the weeds, but it seems like what he was talking about, there's a way to solve another problem by making that an incentive and not a rule.
That's well and good, but I think part of this new comp plan, the vision was you're going to have retail on the ground floor. I mean, it's as any retailer or any restaurant person would tell you, if you don't have something on the ground floor, it's
If you're in a V zone, can you put retail on the ground floor?
if you're in an AE zone,
But not a V.
I do not believe so.
Well, it's
Let's ask her.
I am not a floodplain expert. I can't explain to you how all of that works.
So like down here, actually the VE zone, I don't know how, but it's now part of this side of the Vistero is the AE zone.
Yep.
I don't know what kids draw on a crayon with these flood maps, but that's crazy. But they're like that, huh? But I think we have to have a discussion that I kind of agree with you, but we still want to have retail, especially in the AE zone, some of these nodes on the ground floor.
Well, I agree too in the A zone. Yeah, I can see.
I think if you guys give us general direction, we can get into some of these details as part of the LPA, and staff can certainly do a lot of that heavy lifting and come back with suggestions. But what complicates it is you're dealing with an FAR, you're also dealing with a number of stories, and you're dealing with a height restriction based on measurement from BFE to wherever your roof line is and what kind of roof you have. So we have to look at all those. You can't look at those in a vacuum. And then we have, someone that's in a V zone will not be able to rebuild commercial below. Someone that's in an A zone will, if they dry flood proof. And that's going to be a financial decision if they can afford to do that. So someone in the V zone loses one floor of, either if they had tenants, they can lose one entire tenant, or that's all square footage that was returning money for them that they lose completely. And that's why it's hard to compare. We have to make the distinction as to where it is, how we measure it. We have to look at FAR, we have to look at stories, and we have to look at our height requirements. And I think they all kind of, there are conflicts there, but they all have to mesh at some point.
I think Patrick brings up a really good point when talking about FAR, is that there are a lot of things that feed into what already your box can be. Yeah. If you're looking at a hotel, you're looking first at the density of the underlying future land use district, then the multiplier, then also the FAR and your setbacks and your height. So there are so many components that play into this. And that was one of the reasons why we thought that loosening up the FAR was an option, is because you do have control over it. Like, you, first of all, you start off here. And then, you know, wherever people feel comfortable giving the flexibility, if they feel comfortable giving the flexibility, then you can move on from there. But you already have so many limiting factors. We were trying to figure out how to loosen that up. And also, using the multiplier is not the traditional way of doing it, and it makes it very difficult for most hoteliers to come in here because the density doesn't work.
Correct. I'm trying to think here of how to say this, and based on what you and Patrick have just said, that whole equation, it would appear to me that the easiest thing to fluctuate, because we have now standards that we have to follow that FEMA tells us we have to. We can no longer control some of that. Wouldn't, of all of those things you just said, the easiest thing to potentially fluctuate on would be the overall height. If someone needed something more, as opposed to the floor area ratio or the density, or I guess what I'm trying to say is, in order for me to make this project work, I need an extra story. Well, then we could adjust that and not have to mess with everything else.
But you can't get an
But you
extra
can't.
story if you don't have enough FAR, because each story adds that much footprint, square footage. So if you have a 10,000 square foot building, next floor 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. So that's how your FAR multiplies. So
No, I get that.
you
and
have to have the additional, and that's one of the limiting factors, is you might be able to have more, in some places you find that you might be able to have more units, or you might be able to have more height, but if they all don't match up, then you actually can't build that building. Looking at Margaritaville, for example, it had a limit. They're at 1.55, and that's for both lots. So there are two parcels. So we're looking at 1.55 for two parcels, but it's all on one parcel. So it's cumulative on one parcel. But there, one of the limits was height, because you wanted to be able to have the visibility to the water. So even if you could give them, if you gave them more FAR, you still didn't want them going higher. So they all have to kind of work together, and it's hard to find the right, the magic mix. And so having some flexibility on one of those, saying, okay, this is our hard limit on height, or this is our hard limit on density, or this is our hard limit on whatever. Our setbacks are kind of our standard hard limits. And then beyond that, you can kind of wiggle around the other ones. And we were looking at how the FAR is the limiting factor, and if we're willing to give more height, you still can't build any taller. So, how do we make sure that people can build the things they're trying to build, and that the code would allow them to build? But then the comp plan says, no, you can't, because comp plan is the rule. You can't go beyond it.
Say the rooftop to then become a functioning open concept thing, as opposed to being called a floor. I mean, a restaurant with open whatever that would have, not solid walls and things like that. It could have green space, it could have restaurants, it could have whatever, but it would provide, another avenue of entertainment or function for the community, and yet it would not necessarily be called a floor.
So that could be part of the definition of it. The same way that we have a definition for building coverage. We include any roofed area, screened area, but not unroofed or screen roofed area. So your pool doesn't count, but your lanai, if it has a roof over it, does. So it would be just a definitional thing. So that could be included.
It would have to be a little bit of coverage, but nothing that has four walls around it or something.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be habitable space.
Right.
That might be the way it's defined, as habitable space. The same way, like maybe your parking area, you could have your parking area not count as it, because it's not habitable space. Nobody's staying in the cars.
Right.
That's, storage space, essentially.
Rita, you look like you want to say something.
No, the only thing I was going to say was, going back to public benefit, I really liked reading this information that was put in here from, I guess it's Polk County. I thought that that narration of priorities was very good, and quite honestly, several of these are our priorities. So I preferred this just because I'm not a number person, I'm a picture person, and the words painted the picture for me. And so I liked this narration of public benefits versus the point system.
Okay, yeah, and I
Just
think
as
that
something to add in, since you put that in the packet.
yeah, and I think that we would agree that a point system is an easy way for a developer to understand what they can get, but it doesn't give you the kind of flexibility that you want when somebody's coming in with a commercial plan development. If they come to you, it sounds like you really want the flexibility to work with them and get the thing that the community needs and wants at that time, as long as that's included in the comprehensive plan as a priority.
But if we implemented a point kind of system like that, is there anything to say that there couldn't be an additional variance or something granted to that? Is this because it would be part of the comp plan, or is this part of the town codes?
So it would probably be finalized as part of the code, so the land development code. The comprehensive plan would just sort of be the guardrails saying this is the maximum FAR, and then we could also say this is the base FAR, this is the middle FAR, and, you'd have to work up to it. Maybe, this is the base FAR, everybody can get this and, do the regular zoning requirements, but if you want to go above that, then you have to give more and you have to go through the CPD process, something like that. So it would all be worked out within the land development code, but we could put a few more guardrails within the comprehensive plan, so it was clear when somebody read it, they didn't think that right off the bat, oh, I get 2.5 FAR. They know, no, everybody starts here, and then you have to give more to get more.
And
so it's a...
And I think from what Anita said, I appreciate that provides a mechanism for us to have our discussion about our priorities are. This is what someone else's priorities are,
Yeah.
what our priorities are, and then, as you say, for a developer, then they have something known, and they can, and it's not just that they can't come and ask to put in a CPD and go down that route, but they know that that's expensive. And so if there's enough of a mechanism there where they can figure out what it costs for them to get what they want within this, then they can make a business decision based on those numbers.
And I think that's really the reason that we think this is a good option, is because we want to give developers a reason to give more. We don't want them to meet the minimum side setbacks. We don't want them, especially on the beach, we know we want more visibility. So if we're willing to give them a few more rooms, if we're willing to give them an additional story, and for that we get a nice big view shed of the beach, or for that we get a trolley, if for that, whatever it is that the community needs, like giving them a reason to give more as opposed to just meeting the code. Because if they just meet the code, you end up with a square, you end up with this height, you end up with these setbacks. You know what you're getting, and not saying it's a bad product, just saying it's not a product that you were involved in, that you got more out of, that you got the design that really works for Fort Myers Beach. You got the design that works for Holiday Inn. You got the design, you got their design because they could meet your code. So this kind of gives them an option to go for more and give us more.
And I think one thing too that I think is really important with these incentives is that their duration, their ability to last, is going to be the same as the building and the use that they're getting. So I understand someone says, well, I'll give you a trolley, but the trolley is going to last 5 years, right? And then the building's still there. Things like that are really important. Beach accesses, particularly where there aren't any down south. Any kind of open space. I think, and I kind of agree that I'm not afraid of height necessarily. If that height comes with
Something.
bigger setbacks, more clear area underneath it, some other important elements.
Can I ask a question on that height issue? Because we've had a number of good conversations on height, and I'm in that camp as well. I have a bias against height, but I don't want to rule it out because there may be some spectacular opportunities where the public benefit of having a higher building is just overwhelming, and I don't want to deny us that opportunity to at least see or hear that pitch. Have we done that, Sarah, or do we have flexibility for folks to come in and offer a project that goes a little bit higher particularly if it has a significant public benefit?
So the comprehensive plan doesn't have a height limit as far as I'm aware. It's just within the land development code. So if they want to get more height, they can ask for that. The problem right now is the limiting factor is the FAR. So they couldn't go up.
And they couldn't come in for a new CPD or a special exception or a variance to solve that problem under the current comp plan?
No, I mean, what they could come in for is they could come in for a CPD or they could ask for a variance from the height. But they can't ask for an increase from the FAR because that's the hard limit in the comp plan. So the way comprehensive plans work, that's it. That's where
I'd like to create a comp plan where, to the mayor's point, that's not our goal, is to have taller buildings. But if somebody does come in with something clever and innovative and really with tremendous public benefit, I'd want to at least create a path where we could hear it, because I hate to deny us those sort of unique opportunities. So just thinking out loud.
But didn't you just say that you could do that without having to change the FAR ratio? You just said you could ask for a variance for height.
You can ask for a variance for height, yes, but
not FAR.
Yeah. So
But you can't get
and
the
I
height.
believe what Patrick has said from the beginning is that the current FARs, as they are in the comp plan, would work for the rest of the island. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the zoning dictates the FAR, right? Or dictates what can be built there.
the zoning district has a specific FAR, yes, but they can come in and get a CPD and go to the max that the comprehensive plan future land use district allows. The maximum future land use district is pedestrian commercial, which is the downtown in Santini. So that's 2.5. Everything else is 1.5.
So what I'm trying to say is that these nodes that we're talking about, what is your vision or what is your plan to maybe take what is currently allowed in those two zones that you just talked about and use that same formula for these nodes that are going to go down the island? Not reinventing the wheel. It's opening up the.
Yeah, now you have me intrigued. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's opening up. It's keeping the playing field level for everybody. You know what you're getting into before you get there. And there's still an avenue for you within these nodes to be able to do some of the things that may benefit you financially better and still achieve it. But then you have to give things back to the community.
No, I think we're on the same page. I would also just, on the node front, and again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but there may be another node at the Beach Baptist area. They've got 3.5 acres there, and they're talking about some very innovative things with significant public benefit, including for our school. So just as we look at our nodes, just food for thought. We want to be very careful because that's a very, it's a sensitive neighborhood, and we want to be very careful about it. But I don't want to limit that opportunity, particularly as it potentially benefits the school.
And I'll just chime in on that whole development idea really scares me because that is completely surrounded by residential areas.
And I'm not sure that 3 acres is an adequate area to do enough development. I think that would be an appropriate place for maybe a CPD or something along those lines, but I don't know that would be something we would want to encourage.
I would just ask that folks keep an open mind.
Oh, yeah.
Until we see the opportunity. But yes, point well taken.
If I could just clarify a few little points. As the mayor said, I think in most instances the FAR does work. One of the things that we could look at is currently you have to calculate from the ground floor when you calculate your FAR. I think if you excluded your parking garage, for example, underneath from the FAR, so let's say you're allowed 3 stories, you gain a third in FAR. I think that provides that extra flexibility. If you're allowed 4 stories, it's a fourth that you gain by not having to count the parking underneath as FAR. So that could be kind of an easy fix. Just want to touch upon also timeline to get the comp plan amendment done, and then once you change your comp plan, you might have to make some changes to your land development code to implement that. But I think the idea of 2-3 years, I think that's too long. I think that happens in a lot of jurisdictions when they revamp their entire comp plan and they do a ton of public involvement. I think in our case we need to work a lot quicker. If if we really roll up our sleeves, I think we can get it done in a year. The biggest hurdle is for us to change our comp plan, we have to have transmittal hearings. LPA, council, has to go to the state has to review, send it back to us, and we have to have adoption hearings. That's about 5 months right there. So even if we work really quickly, I'm thinking a year makes sense. But I think we should really target a year at the most. And if we have to go a little past that, that's fine. But that, to me, that's realistic. And then the LDC amendments, again, same thing. If we roll up our sleeves and do it real quick, I think 6 months after that, we can get it done. So a process, Anita, that could typically take 2.5 years, 3 years in some instances, we could ratchet that down to a year and a half.
And Patrick, what does that time frame do in the mind of a redeveloper? Are they going to wait that out, or could they proceed immediately, given the fact that we're going to try to stay similar to what our current comp plan is like?
I think some of the stuff that Dan is alluding to is you have the flexibility right now through a plan development process to ask for what you'd like. You can ask for more units and you can ask for more height because we have that flexibility right now. You are capped with the FAR though. What it doesn't do, and again, the mom and pop, there's a great cost involved in going through that process. So I think most people realize it now and having to rebuild their homes, having to hire an engineer, having to get inspections, there is so much involved in redeveloping a property that for almost anybody, including Scott on a very small piece, to take that on, you're looking at a few $100,000 just in getting your entitlements. And that's what is really hurting the mom and pops. The bigger developer will spend that money and will move forward with the plan development process and will ask for what he wants, and he'll go to the LPA and to council to hopefully get an approval. But the mom and pop doesn't really have a few $100,000 to throw at entitlement, so they're waiting for us to help him out in some way. So as I mentioned, through that conversion ratio, which I don't like, I hope we get rid of it moving forward. But in the short term, we could possibly help some of those mom and pops through that.
Very good, thank you.
And there's also something that was discussed with staff some time ago, is this lean urbanism and pink zones. So the idea is that when you have a small shop, that when you come up with a complicated table like we have of different incentives and bonuses, that you bundle them up in a template, a few different templates. And so when someone wants to, if one of those templates fits somebody's needs, that means they don't have to go through and ask for the invariances, that it's basically streamlining the process because they've gone with something that's already been, in a sense, pre-approved. And they call them the pink zones because it's less red tape. But the only problem with that is I think it'd take a long time because I would have to come at the end of the entire process, then hire someone to come up with templates. So it'd be worse for time, but it'd be better for money for the people with the small lots.
I would, as we talk about these big concept ideas, I am always thinking about what that definition is. And, to all of us, Scott's very much a boutique, mom and pop, whatever we want to call it, because we all know what it is. But what are the other ones? How many other ones do we have? Is the Sandpiper a mom and pop hotel? Is the Neptune a mom and pop hotel? Or is it the Beacon? Or I'm trying to think, or the little Gulf Village that was there, or Myerside, or what? So I think as we talk about this, we need to think about how to define what is that mom and pop project, and is it because it's locally owned? Is it because it's a number of units? What is it? So I'm going to forget this, so you all remember it, okay? Because that'll be important to define.
So one thing that would help staff, I'm going to be meeting with the comprehensive plan consultant tomorrow to go over what we discussed here today. One thing that would be really helpful for me is understanding, what your top priorities are, and also what FARs you would be interested in potentially seeing, because he is going to be putting together some visuals so that everybody can understand this. I don't know exactly how he's going to do it, but if you just automatically know that's too much and you don't want to know what that might look like, then say off the table. But if you want to see what it looks like, because I think that that's an important thing to think about, is that until you see it, you don't know what it looks like. I mean, we have in our mind, because of the box, you know, when you look at a simple floor area ratio, you think of a box. You just put the box in the middle and you build it up. You just stack it up. But there are a lot of creative ways to do it, and architects do a phenomenal job of making designs work. So let me know what you think your limit is, and I'll talk with Eddie and his team about what kind of visuals you want to see.
I think we've kind of already discussed what the limit is. I'm really struggling trying to figure out why staff and
So
the
is
group are
2.5
pushing for
the
more
limit?
floor area ratio.
I don't know. You know, just so you all know, I asked for this visualization because I'm a visual person. Because, you know, Patrick might be able to see what that FAR looks like in his head, or the engineers might be able to see that because that's how their brains work. My brain doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. So I thought it was important to be able to show us. Remember when we asked you to show us what the cake looked like, the tiering looked like, and it just became instantly easier to make it. And so, you know, I even suggested take a project that the community reacts to. Marguerite, sorry, Tom. But take a project that we already know what it's there. Now, what if instead of 1.55, it had been 2.5, or it had been 4? What would that look like? And then you could see that in the intensely commercial zone, but then in the nodes, what if, you know, what if you allowed the CB zoning, as Bill is calling it, or I mean, as it's called, what if that was, instead of 1, what if that was 2? I think showing us various options. I know for one, I couldn't tell you right now, well, I don't want to see 4 because I don't know what it looks like. I don't want to see 2.5 because I don't know what it looks like. I know what Margaritaville looks like, and I know what the Sea Gypsy looked like, and I think that that's just important for, at least for me, and I think for most people.
Okay, and that was one of the reasons why I pointed out with Margaritaville, that is a cumulative. So what it appears to be is different than what it actually is, if that makes sense.
Well, I think simple math would tell you if they're a 1.55 and you go to 3, it's going to be double what you see, no matter how you.
But what I'm saying is that lot, that area is also includes the area on the other side of the street. It's cumulative. So.
Building over there too.
Add it all together.
No, but
Hold on.
I'm trying to help you understand the visual. So.
No, I understand. I get the visual. I mean, it's all mathematical at the end of the day, and how you make an egg is how you make an egg. is what I'm struggling with is, if we've said here multiple times that the FAR that's currently in the comp plan works, but in the areas in which it can be applied doesn't, why not just change the areas that it can be applied to through these nodes and use what's already there? You zone it the same way.
So
Yeah, but-
what would you like? I mean,
But Dan, I think
is 2.5 the top? Is 1.5? I mean, because it's 1.5 everywhere, and then 2.5 in downtown and Santini. Is 2.5 the top in the nodes?
I don't think,
or-
I think that's what the mayor is suggesting.
Okay.
Forgive me, is that for all the nodes, all the nodes have the same opportunities as the commercial and Santini Plaza. I think, correct?
That's what I'm trying to get at, because then that's their ceiling, that's their cap.
And I think, I don't disagree with 2.5 being a cap, but I think it would be useful to have, because the consultant presented 5. I think people need to see what 5 is to know that they don't want 5. Okay, so I think that would be a helpful visual just for the public to understand.
Yeah, they'd be
what
going
that
from
means.
a smart car to a semi.
but
I
people
would
need to
point out,
see it.
I would point out one thing is that, you know, the Santini Plaza and the downtown pedestrian district are unique for a couple of reasons. One is that Santini is already where there's a lot of high buildings, right? Santini is already where there's a lot of high buildings, and the downtown area is known to be a commercial area. The other nodes tend to be in closer to residential areas. So I don't, yeah, so kind of a compromise, I think we could have two different FARs, one for the two big areas, and one for the, and a lower one for the more residential areas, instead of having 5 different FARs.
And I'm not advocating for that's what that is going to be in the node. All I'm simply saying is instead of messing with the comp plan, focus on the nodes that we're looking at. Then we can have the discussion of what that FAR should be within that zone, but stays within the comp plan. That's all I'm trying to get to. Is
Yeah, well,
Sorry,
to get to
I just was having a
2.5
hard
in
time
most of the nodes,
understanding.
so we would need a comp plan amendment to get to 2.5 in all other nodes except for downtown and Santini.
Well, then maybe 2 point. I don't know if that's the will of everybody that here. I don't.
Plus, the other thing that you mentioned is I think you're right, of where can you apply it? But one of the limiting factors is right now, the number of stories and our density multiplier is limiting you. So even if you do have a 1.5, right now you are limited by other factors. And you can go through a plan development and try to explain that, and it's complicated and people get confused, and people are saying, well, you're giving it to this person, you're not giving it to this person. So we have a lot of layers, and I think there's still a need to look at the comp plan to clean things up. And I'm not saying just give away anything, I'm just saying clean it up and clarify it.
On the clarification front, Sarah, because we're talking about the two existing nodes, the downtown district and Santini Plaza. When you say the downtown district, does that include Moss Marine?
No, that actually isn't part of the downtown.
Okay, that's an interesting thing.
It's Diamond Head, down to Old San Carlos. It makes kind of a big triangle. It's here, down to Times Square, down Old San Carlos, Matanzas, back.
Well, we may want to think about the boundaries of these because the world has changed post-Ian. And I was also thinking about Santini Plaza. Does that include the Wyndham and the Outrigger as well?
Nope, it includes Santini
Okay.
Plaza.
Because they're going to have a unique need as well if they're going to rebuild. So, just thinking out loud.
Just as a suggestion, Dan, not to muddy the waters, but, I'm sorry, Mayor, do you care if I call you Dan?
You call me whatever you want.
Thank you so much. I think that for this presentation, to answer your question, Sarah, if it were up to me, I would ask Ed whatever he's comfortable showing us, because, you know, if I had, I'd rather play 7-card poker than 5. I'd like having more cards. So if I can discard instantly a couple, then, you know, it helps you narrow it down. And I think if we can make our vision visual, it will help us and it will help the community.
Would it make sense that right now we have 1.2 in many places as a base? You can go up to 1.5. We have 2.5 in some areas as a maximum. And then if we took those and put that in a visual and give us also the explanation of with the parking underneath or without the parking,
Yep,
and
that's
then
a
I
good
would
one.
go either to a 3 or a 5 to show just something much bigger than what we currently have, what that looks like. So if you look at what you have in the code right now in the comp plan, 1.2, 1.5, 2.5, and then either a 3 or a 4 or 5 to kind of have that extreme visual where people get an understanding of the scale.
And if you could also provide some clarity, if we're going to increase this FAR, even for the node areas, I want to make sure that everybody has to go through, hopefully in a much more efficient and friendly way than one of the developer who's sitting here today. In other words, I want to make sure we're not losing the town's ability to negotiate public benefit for the town. I don't want to just give that away. And let's just be clear on that, because I just don't want there to be any confusion.
Okay, yes.
Yep, thanks.
You know what, Sarah, would also be helpful? Because like Patrick said, it is complicated, this notion of all the factors that ultimately quantify what you can have on a parcel. It isn't just FAR, it's density, it's zoning, it's all of those things. If I'm seeing a flow chart somehow, you know, if you have this, then this, then this, then this, And there are some of those charts in the comp plan, I know, but that might be helpful for everybody, just like as a review. So you can see that you can't really isolate one issue and talk about it. You have to talk about it all comprehensively to achieve the ultimate result. Thank you.
Well, have you got the direction? I think that
Yes.
it's.
That was great conversation.
I just, yeah. Hopefully you got out of that what. There's a lot of passion here.
Yes.
And I would also
But-
just, one thing that also kind of really bothered me with the presentation that doesn't really have anything to do with the big FAR discussion is there was a lot of residential areas that were taken in to the commercial zones, and I think that at least the constituents I talked to don't want that intrusion. It's in our current comp plan to not intrude into residential areas as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll go back to the first one since Keith made me skip over. Oh, we'll take a quick 10-minute break and then we'll come back. What time is it? We'll be back at 3:10. All right, everyone. We'll call the meeting back to order. It's 3:10. We'll go back to the first item on the agenda, which is the recovery planning issues. And the reason that this is here is staff came in and spoke to the mayor, or the manager and myself about some of the units on the ground level, and staff not being able to prove that they existed before 1984. They can't prove it didn't, or vice versa. And how do you get there? And our code is very vague on what it will accept. So the grand synopsis, they came to us and asked us which way we want to go, more strict, more lenient in allowing these to be built back. And neither one of us felt that was a decision that he and I should make, without everyone here being able to weigh in on it. So that's why it's here before us. I think we're all familiar with what I'm talking about. So I'll let someone from, Jason, you want to come up and kind of give a more detailed review of what I'm talking about? Oh, I didn't see Eli back there. He's saying no.
Who's on the hot seat, Eli or Jason?
Yeah, both.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for entertaining this discussion. I think it's very important, and it fits in neatly with the higher level discussion that you're having here today. Just for anybody that may not be aware, my name is Jason Smalley. I'm a senior planner here with the town in planning and zoning, and I'd like to introduce my co-planner here.
That's on.
Eli Lee, planner for the town of Fort Myers Beach.
So, as the mayor so aptly nutshelled the situation here, basically what is happening is staff is tasked with determining in multiple policies, particularly in the post-disaster build back, whether or not an additional unit is legal. And I use the term legal in sort of a pseudo quote here because legal itself is, it has a very specific reference to it. Was it permitted? Was it inspected? Did it go through a CO at some point? The issue and the reason that I put pseudo quotes around is because most of the island was developed prior to the town's codes as they are today. And that's obvious if you look at the housing stock before the storm. So much of the information that would have been there 20, 30 years ago, may have been with original owners, really no longer exists today. And when I say it doesn't exist, it literally doesn't exist. I'm sorry? Absolutely. And unfortunately, we can't rely on the previous jurisdictions who may have had a planning office or didn't have a planning office in Lee County's case. They didn't actually have a physical planning office until 1983. Those records are spotty. They do not exist. They may not be comprehensive in a way that staff feels comfortable establishing that legality. Okay, so what we've come today is to just sort of express some of the problems that we run into as we try and determine this. And I'll state it right up front that a large majority of our time as staff members is dedicated to this issue. That's why we've brought it to the attention of the elected officials and the town manager, who are nice enough to sit down and listen to us tell them about this. And so I want to express to you how we run into things and what the problems that we believe are inhibiting us from making a determination one way or the other for folks. When somebody wants to apply the post-disaster build back, and they state to us, we have multiple units, be that a duplex, a triplex, a single-family home with a small, tiny home in the rear of it. I can't easily go back to, say, a Lee property appraiser and determine, was that legally done? I can establish through Lee property appraisers that it's on a record, that it may be on a tax card. People have been paying taxes on that thing. But through a couple examples that I will show you here in a moment, I want to show you why we can't establish the actual legality of that. So the first thing I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention, this is the extent of what's available to us in language in both the comprehensive plan and in the land development code for trying to make heads or tails about whether somebody's duplex or mother-in-law's quarters is legal or not. And as you can see, it I believe tries to give us some examples of things to use. If you'll go down to the last portion of the statement there where it talks about photographs, diagrams, plans, affidavits. Well, this seems fairly comprehensive. Something like that must exist, of course. Well, hit or miss, some things may exist in our own records. Some things may be able to be gathered from Lee Property Appraiser. But most of this stuff isn't determinative. Does somebody have photographs from 1962 when the home was supposedly built? Probably not. Offhand, there may be something in a newspaper, the house was built. Hey, that's great. That's a great piece of information. But more often than not, your house wasn't important enough to show up in a newspaper with a date on it where I can establish from a photograph. Same thing with diagrams and plans. As I mentioned before, the plans oftentimes don't exist. The original blueprints, the original designs, the original stamped copies. If your house was built in 1962, quite honestly, it was the Wild West down here. You paid your stamp fee for it, and you built the house. And as long as it didn't fall down on your head, nobody really cared what was going on down here. So when we say diagrams and plans, we may find something from, say, 2000, if it was supposedly built in 62, or even 89. We find ourselves with huge gaps of time to try and establish, again, the legality of this. Same thing with appraisals, tax records. Infrequently do we find appraisals. That's more of a recent, I think. Do you have a question?
Just wanted to just to help set the table for
Yes.
you're doing a great job of explaining the conundrum, but are you under pressure? Are we under pressure as a town as to how we remedy this? In other words, are the FEMA people breathing down your throat, or is it more just a broader policy decision in terms of what direction the town wants to go?
Excellent question. So this is going to really sound weird for me to say, but FEMA doesn't care about this particular issue all that much. I know it's one of the very few things that they haven't seemed to have put their fingers in recently, but FEMA is concerned with floodplain, and it may be tied up with the issue of, as the mayor had mentioned, an enclosed mother-in-law's suite down on the ground floor, and that's mixed up in the discussion that we're having today. But my discussion is a bit wider than that. So in this case, it's really about our local density. These are our local codes, our local understandings about how a neighborhood should be set up and what types of uses and structures we would expect to find in a single-family residential neighborhood. Okay? So the issue that we have today, as I'm sure you're aware of before the storm, is that there are many accessory apartments or mother-in-law's suites, or however you want to describe those units that are enclosed either underneath, within the existing structure of a home where it's been sort of reconfigured to allow for multiple, perhaps rentable units inside of what from the outside looks like a single-family home. If every two dwelling unit structure on the island looked like a standard duplex with a firewall in between two units and two doors leading into the structures, that would make our job a little bit easier. But oftentimes they're not designed that way. They're not your standard duplex or your triplex. It's a single family home that has internally been rearranged, or as mentioned before, a unit that has grown or evolved or have somehow become the ground floor of that structure. The issue is it's multifaceted, because when we tell people, hey, the language that we have here in the comp plan, it tells us to bring these things, oftentimes they can't be found. As I just mentioned, the Lee Property Appraiser and Lee County themselves are probably getting tired of seeing our residents come down to them and ask for everything in the package. everything in their historical package. Because, again, it's very, very spotty. It is, according to Lee County, multiple times I've heard them tell me this, for residential properties, they don't believe they need to keep the records more than 10 years. So just think about how many homes on this island are older than 10 years old, and according to Lee County, they aren't necessarily required to keep those documents for you anymore available.
Jason, sorry to interrupt you again, but it helps me think about this from a policy standpoint. Jane and some of the other folks here, as we were talking about the comp plan, made a number of references to how this island is changing, and particularly from a socioeconomic standpoint, and that it would be harder for regular folks to live on this island. Is for us to be generous in this, does that help mitigate that issue and give a little relief and create some additional socioeconomic diversity to our island? And I guess that to everybody really. As we think about the solution, I just think it helps to set the table philosophically as we go forward.
So I'm not a high level planner. I'm sort of in the trenches guy. But to answer your question, I think in some respects it does. In some respects, some people's toehold in this island is dependent on them having income from a rentable unit. Okay? And I totally appreciate that. And the worst thing in the world for me is to talk to somebody and see them in the face, see in their face, this is the one decision made by a staff member that may determine whether or not they can realistically stay on the island with the values, the land values as they are today. I would only caution in saying that if we were to prioritize that side of the ledger to absolutely ensure that everybody that needs to have a second dwelling unit that knows and believes and thinks they have a second unit. The trade-off here is, what does that look like in your neighborhoods, and what is that quality of life for the other neighbors who may not need the benefit of having a second unit that's rentable to them, or who bought 40 years ago with the idea that they were buying into a single family neighborhood only to have it change around them. Change is natural. It's just a question of, does staff want to be, is staff really delegated the responsibility to determine how those neighborhoods are going to evolve? And that's why I'm really happy that we've been asked to come here. We've been given the opportunity to come here and talk to you about this. Yes.
Jason, one question and two comments, I guess. So when the town incorporated in 1995, was there, my understanding is there was some kind of a process addressing units, and that'd be good for you to clarify, just to give us a little understanding.
Absolutely.
And then on the affordability of the island having a unit, I think there is some truth to that for people to offset their mortgage or their insurance or their, all the expenses that go into living on this island. But also, if you look at the current comp plan that we have, there's a discussion in there about accessory units.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a distinction that's made between when people live in their house full-time with an accessory unit versus just accessory units across the board. So I think those are two different animals. One would lend itself to vacation rental scenario. The other one is going to be where the owner's there. It's going to be controlled. It may be, instead of short-term rental, maybe longer-term rental. There's someone there. There is some control. And it does provide for some affordability where someone might not be able to afford a house, but they might be able to afford a little apartment. So I would consider all these things, but I'd like to hear about what they did in 1995 and what was discussed.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. And I'm trying to condense my knowledge of many decades of development on the island into a short time frame. But thank you again for bringing that up. Yes, there was actually an accessory apartment list that was compiled by the county. And those records actually go past our incorporation date. They were keeping records and helping us out into, I believe, 2005 with that document. This document was sort of bequeathed to us when we became our own municipality. It contains, by my count, roughly 75 maximum apartments, accessory apartments that were known to exist, and for which I'm assuming the county had some evidence to actually put them on this comprehensive list that they handed to us as we sort of set off on our journey here. But what we've come to understand is that probably wasn't a fully comprehensive list. I'm sure they did their absolute best, but I've run across certain circumstances where I can establish in the record through hearing officers' records that there are certain units that were legally allowed, totally kosher with us. We would accept it any day of the week, but it wasn't recorded on that list of approximately 75 units. Is it a great start? And do I first go to that list every time this issue starts coming up? Absolutely. It's the first place I go to, is to hopefully hit the grand prize here for this customer, because that makes my job a whole lot easier. More often than not, they do not exist. And that's when people come to us with reams of records that they can find, oftentimes really just sort of printouts from Lee Property Appraiser's website, showing me little bits and bobs on there saying, well, look, it says I have a second dwelling unit on there. Shouldn't that be enough? Look, I've been taxed for this thing for 20 years, and the previous owner was taxed for another decade before that. Isn't that good enough to make my case? And then I have to sit back and sort of explain the idea of what it appears as to a layman looking at Lee Property Appraiser, and what I know as a professional working with this every day. And thank you for the opportunity to move on to just the next slide here. And this is how I try and make my point to folks when they ask this question. That's actually the next slide. This came out of our records. This letter was produced by Lee County in 2000. The nutshell, and you're welcome to get a copy of this if you would like, but the nutshell of the letter is basically stating that the building official, or excuse me, the planning official at the time made a determination that a structure was in fact a triplex and not a duplex. If something in the record from 25 years ago comes across my desk and says that, I'm going to give a lot of weight to that. This is really good information. I don't use this letter as a way to say this isn't good enough, but I want to. It's a good way to make my next point, which is, and I apologize that you cannot see this, so I'll try and describe it. So if you look down here, what I've circled, what this is really saying is that the house was originally built in 1962. That's an established date, right? That's set in stone. When they came back in 2000, nearly 40 years later, and said, yes, I believe this is actually a triplex. They have no definitive proof that it was built at the same exact time in 1962 as the rest of the structure. It was the determination of the building official, of a inspector who was sent out by the planning official that in all likelihood it was built concurrently or around the same date of 1962. So they said, fine, we think this was a triplex, and so you have a single family home and a triplex on this lot. Great, we'll add it to the record. The point I'm making is down here at the bottom, and again, I'm sorry you can't see this, but all of the dates that show the independent units inside of that structure from Lee Property Appraiser are tagged in 1962. Were all of them built in 62, even though they added to the record an additional unit 40 years later? I can't really tell. There's no definitive way to say that to meet the high bar of legality in our code that I have to apply. So this is just an example of why when somebody comes in and says, look, on Lee Property Appraiser, it says my house was built in 1972. And all of these other 2 units or 3 units in there were all built concurrently. Look at the dates. They all say the same thing. Well, this is one of the reasons I have to stop and say, wait a minute. This doesn't necessarily prove what we need it to prove. Is it a good piece of the puzzle? Absolutely. The problem is getting the rest of the puzzle, at least in enough to satisfy staff who feel as though we're being tasked with deciding what any given single-family home block should look like and what the quality of life of everyone else in that block is. Yes.
And so, um, I know someone who has an older home, and the older home is still existing, it's still standing, but the mother-in-law apartment was wiped out. So there's that. She'd like to rebuild her mother-in-law apartment, and of course then it would be an older home with a mother-in-law apartment. But I'm just now thinking, the light bulb was, what if or what if that had been a triplex and it had been blown down? Would you want that size of a structure on that street? Is that what you're talking about? So is there a difference between older homes that still exist that, you're basically filling in a space versus something that would be built brand new, which would likely be quite large to scale in an existing neighborhood?
So the scale of the actual structure itself is probably going to be determined by, well, will be determined by the setbacks, by how much building coverage they can have. So I don't know that filling in the bottom level of an existing structure is going to make the structure look more out of place in the rest of the neighborhood. And if I take your question correct, really, I think the discussion here is not so much that it was obviously a triplex and obviously that it was out of scale to the rest of the neighborhood so much as you have what would be deemed to be a fairly normal sized single family structure, at least that's what appears from the outside, maybe with an extra entrance way. That would be the only way for you to tell the difference. But inside, it may have been reconfigured. And when they come back to say, I need to claim my dwelling units, my density, I'm vested with that. This home was destroyed. The post-build back disaster policy vests two things. It vests me with the right to have the same number of legal dwelling units that can be established prior to the storm, and the interior area of the home. Okay, so really what they're saying to us, we want to build back, we want to do it right, we know we're going to have to build up, but I want to have my dwelling units back. I want to have my units that for a decade or more I've been holding out on VRBO or wherever and registered with a town. I'm not trying to hide anything from you. I was sold this property and I believe it to be a multi-unit structure. All the MLS listings show it as a multi-unit structure. So that's the give and take that I get from customers, and I don't want to say no to them. I don't want to crush dreams. Just looking for a little guidance.
So essentially, when we were talking about this, we used a baseball, at least I did, tie goes to the runner. I think what he's looking for is who's the runner and what of those things that are listed up there are we comfortable with the staff making a decision one way or another? What is an acceptable thing if it can't be proved by the town that it didn't exist, and they can't prove that it did exist, is what you're asking for. So who's the runner in this case, and what data is sufficient enough to issue that tie?
I think that's exactly where we're trying to get at. We're not looking for a punch list from everybody that's going to meet every possible situation. We're just looking for, as you so aptly put, who wins the tie.
Real
And
quick.
we're
I was just going to go ahead.
And we're not talking about grandfathered apartments that we knew were not legal before when, okay.
Patrick, I'm sorry. Go ahead and answer.
No. It was going to be a continuation of something I said before.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up on Patrick's point. This concept of having somebody live there year-round and have an extra place that's in dispute, does that make, if we took that as counsel to sort of give you counsel, does that complicate your world? Because
Well,
how are you going to know if they live there year-round?
Exactly. That's what I was going to
In other words, is there a way to do what he suggested? Because it was a really interesting point. Is there a way to do that makes your life simpler, or does it just make your life more complicated?
I think there's probably a couple ways to do that. I think Patrick probably has a good idea here. I've heard him say it before. But there could be a couple different strategies or tactics that you could take to decide who wins the tie. Homesteading.
Of course, then it
And
could
or
sell.
leases, if they had a 1-year lease, if they,
True.
with, in the apartment.
I think the issue. I'm sorry to interrupt. I think the issue with basing this on anything that is a legal document, it becomes nigh impossible for staff members to go back and say, I need you to submit a legal agreement between you and your tenant. I don't have a leg to stand on. They might do it just to be nice or move the ball forward, but I don't think staff wants to get involved with asking for too much private information that we can't glean from a proxy like homesteading or some other strategy.
Well,
Yes.
as a realtor, I see lots of things that are legal and not legal, but as
Jane, talking to your. Get it.
As a realtor, I see a lot of things that are legal and non-legal, but there was just basically a date, 1989, that if anything was built after 1989, it's illegal. Anything before that...
84, for flood purposes?
I'm sorry,
Yes.
my brain is not here. But so that would be simple to see from that on the books. If there's a downstairs unit, it's not supposed to be there. Then on the tax roll, it also says apartment, apartment, apartment. Who would write apartment, apartment, apartment if it's just a bedroom? You know, that's a statement, in my opinion. That's a legal document, and you're paying taxes on that square footage. And some of these have been on the rental list with the town for all these years and paying rental taxes and property taxes based on that. Then also, I mean, I had a legal mother-in-law, and my address was on that list. And I have also had the opportunity when I had my little hotel, the house next door to us, they were trying to identify those units. And how we identified that was that there was actually an article in the newspaper about the, now I can't think of the family that, the one where the baby was stolen out of a bedroom. The Lindbergh family stayed in that downstairs unit, and it was in the paper of him staying there out on the patio, and that's how we verified that and got that grandfathered. But the point is, these people have bought these houses with the fact that they had rental units. They were advertised and purchased with these rental units, and to take those away or to say they no longer exist is a big take. And that's why we had the pre-disaster build back, so that if you wanted to come in and do a pre-disaster, you could have whatever unit you have there and bring it up to code. And so now we can't have pre-disaster because we've already had our disaster. But the point is, if there is documentation of any form, on any of these ways that you had that, it should be able to be validated.
John, I have a feeling you got something to say about the legality.
Yeah, I have gone through this issue, or similar type of issue, in some other jurisdictions, or again, some coastal communities, and primarily with downstairs enclosures. And there is some case law, some of it which I was involved in, where the courts have said, not me, the courts have said that reliance upon the tax roll of what the tax roll says is not sufficient. And the reason why is because governments are bifurcated. The tax appraiser and the tax collector's function is to collect as much tax money as possible under the law for the benefit of the local communities. But their job is not to determine that that was legal or not legal. And therefore it cannot be necessarily relied upon as a basis for determining whether or not something was or wasn't legal. So what I would suggest at this point in time, rather than, I think all the comments that have been made are valid, and they require looking into. What I would recommend is, instead of, trying to come up with a solution that may not work at this point, is to put this back with staff and my office, and we'll work up some more of this information to provide some better, maybe some better guidance on, what the courts have previously said on these types of issues, to then share that with you all, and you all then say, well, here's what we feel comfortable with based upon what the courts have said is a permissible manner in which to decide these issues. And some of it is, how long has it been around? But not necessarily, ironically, because it shows up on the tax roll. Because the job of the property appraisers just simply go out there and say, oh, there's 5 bedrooms, or not just 5 bedrooms, 3 units. We're going to tax 3 units, and the owner is paying that. Doesn't necessarily mean, according to the courts, that the creation of those units was legal, and that becomes the issue. And I think that's what we're all struggling with, and trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the property owners, but also complying with the rules that are being given to us, not only by the courts, but to some degree by FEMA and some of the other things that are all affecting this decision-making process. So rather than potentially, not that the conversation and your input is not needed and appreciated, maybe it's premature at this point, and rather than be in a position where we can't make a decision or give concrete guidance, we can look into it and bring this back to both the LPA and the town council at a future MNP. So just a suggestion. We can hash it out as best we can in the meantime.
I'm trying to figure out, John, in my head, why, let's say the group felt it would be better to be more lenient, to allow people, if there was some sort of, whether it was a picture or whatever, can't legally prove it, but you can visually see it was there before, or what is the downside to the town just saying, okay, that's good enough for us, you can move forward?
As I said, my past experiences primarily on this issue has been with respect to downstairs enclosures, and that's where FEMA comes in and says that violates the National Flood Insurance Program guidelines, and you're in violation of those regulations because there's no proof that this existed in the context of specifically with regard to downstairs enclosures, that it existed prior to the creation of the NFIP and that it was illegally created.
I knew that 4-letter word was going to come back into the conversation at some point.
Yeah.
So essentially, we have to do this in order to make sure down the road we're covered, that we didn't allow somebody to have something that we can't prove.
Beyond, to the satisfaction of the courts, whether we are part of the litigation, but to use the unfortunately, it's not a whole lot of court guidance, but to the extent that there is, I'd like to, it would be my recommendation, and it's always my recommendation, that we hew or we get as close to that as possible. What the courts have said is okay, because then that gives us that backstop that I think, as governments we're always looking for, which is, well, the court said this was okay, or this is the way to do it, so let's follow their guidance. And again, that doesn't mean that we can't give as much benefit to the of doubt to the property owner within those 4 corners.
Well, they would still have to meet the 50% rule, no matter what.
Well, if it's
a
downstairs
ground
enclosure, yeah.
apartment.
Well, period, yes.
Right.
And again, that also affects 50% the downstairs enclosure, and those are still issues that have to be resolved. If they're beyond the 50%, then it becomes a question of cost. Do they want to go up? Because it can't stay at assuming these were ground level units.
If they couldn't meet their 50% rule in rebuilding the downstairs, and the upstairs isn't at the height that it would be required to be at the new FEMA regulations, can they just eliminate the downstairs and have the 50% rule for the entire house?
My knee-jerk reaction to that is probably yes, but I can't say for sure. I mean, it's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've asked the same
I've got a question. Since the town manager and staff brought this to us, how do you feel about this proposal going back to staff, hashing it out, and then bringing it up again.
I don't think that would hurt. Helps us define who the runner is and what a tie is.
Well,
Gives us some more data there.
That's a fallacy, because you're either out or safe. There is no tie against the runner.
Right, and that's what I wanted to address is in addition to the floodplain compliance, it's also, do we want to retain our single-family neighborhoods, or do we want to increase that zoning density because we're allowing more multifamily units in a single-family zone? So to me, leniency, the runner is the owner of the property. And if we're stricter, the runner is us, the town. The town is regaining the compliance of a single-family zoning district versus.
Because, Keith, is what you're trying to say is, let's say we go on the leniency side and we say, Joe homeowner, you can have a triplex because you showed it. Now, does that open it up for the next door neighbor who tears their house down and says, well, he's got a multifamily unit in a residential area, now can I do it?
It shouldn't, but what it will do is, if our goal was to retain or regain a single-family neighborhood, we're losing that, but from the opportunity of the destruction that we've incurred.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, do you want us to solve this problem today, or do you want to go back and work on it some more and then bring it back? I'm okay either way, but it seems like you brought us this problem for a reason.
Yeah.
And now I'm hearing, send it back and then we'll hash it out some more and then bring it back.
I'm typically good with ripping the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, me too.
And making a decision. But then that gets back to you guys, if y'all are comfortable at this point saying, let's be more lenient, or giving staff guidance, let's be more lenient or let's be more strict.
I would also think there seems like there's two different burdens that we need here, right? One is if someone wants to build back below the BFE, then if we allow that without proof, then we can get in trouble with the NFIP, right? But the other is that if their house is completely gone and they want to rebuild under the post-disaster build back, then they build back the number of units and the size they had before. And
Well,
they seem like the two different standards.
And John, I have a question. What has been told to us from FEMA and from the state is that you have to follow, after a storm, the requirements set within your code. You can't change your code. So if indeed that is the criteria for which FEMA is going to look at us down the road, our code tells us we can accept affidavits. So if we were to say an affidavit is enough, would we be covered technically because we didn't change our code, and within our code it says we can do it? Would that be a sufficient piece of document to protect us? What is it? How did you say it? Can you argue your position, or however you put it?
You are correct. FEMA takes the position that you have to apply the code as it existed literally on the day before the storm, and not change it to that, to give a favorable outcome. And I use that in a very generic sense. And so to the extent that we're following our code, certainly I would believe and I would argue then that if our code says these are the 3 or 4 or 5 ways in which these issues can be proven and disposed of, my argument would be, back to FEMA, is like, we're just doing exactly what our code says. With that said, we have already experienced unfortunately, the vagaries of FEMA. You have to do this, and a week later it's no, that's not really what we meant. Or my favorite, where we submitted something, a contract to them, and they gave us 4 pages of comments, and at the very end of the analysis says, and oh, by the way, the 3 preceding pages you can't legally rely upon. This is just an advisory opinion and analysis and has no legal import. So, really? So I don't, that's a risk that we take moving forward that I don't know, unfortunately. And I don't think any of us are in a position to say that, FEMA is not going to be a pain in the ass, excuse my language, now and in the future, and as we look to recover from this catastrophic event, unfortunately. And I don't think any of us on the staff level are in a position to say, following the letter of our code is a safe harbor. It should be. It absolutely should be. But I've seen FEMA do really strange crap over the years in my practice of law, and I cannot sit here or stand here and say with 100% certainty that's a complete safe harbor for us, and I don't know if we'll ever know that.
Well, it sounds to me like there's no such thing as a safe harbor with FEMA in general. So I guess if we can go back to that slide that you had up there that had those things on there.
I mean,
is there?
I know in my conversations with Jason and with staff, I know that Jason has dealt with FEMA and other locations on some of these issues. His insight might be of benefit to you all as well, but.
Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
before we go any further, I'd like to provide my input. I think it'd be useful if other people did. To your question as to who the runner is, I would say the homeowner is the runner. That's my personal opinion. That's what I would like to do. Does that mean a few people might take advantage of this? Possibly. But I think most people tend to be honest. And I think if we can relieve additional hardship to people that have gone through major destruction, that should be our intent. So I would say the homeowner is the runner, give them the benefit of the doubt as much as we can. I'd be happy to hear what staff, if we give them that guidance, what they come up with. I don't think we necessarily have to decide. And then the other thing was, Keith brought up, going back to the original density, just a caveat there, and what we have to be careful about is we do grandfather existing units, and again, we don't know if they were legal or not. That's the problem. But strictly going back to the density in the code, I don't think is fully accurate. And I know you didn't mean that, Keith, completely. I just wanted to point that out. And the last thing I'd like to say is, what we should really make sure as a town is 2022 has to become a baseline where this is never an issue again. So I don't know how we document that, we create that baseline, but 2022, if the next storm comes in, we need to go back to that baseline and say yay or nay, and it's got to be black and white.
I agree. I don't think there's a silver bullet today. If we go back and research, those are the options. I think the silver bullet for the next event is that we capture this in code.
I'm with you, Patrick. I tend to lean that the homeowner is, but we also as a town have to be very careful because of the FEMA. And if we can stay within the boundaries that are already in our code, we have a defensible position, is what they like to say. In speaking with the state, when we had our meetings with the state, they said, if you have done all your possible due diligence and you can document that you've done it, you have sufficed our reasoning for trying to prove it. So I guess I'd like to ask you, Jason, roughly off the top of your head, and I know you're not going to be able to tell me, how many cases are we really talking about? A lot of the homes were already completely destroyed, but rough guess, would you be able to tell how many we're talking about here? How many runners do we have?
Can we eliminate this baseball nonsense?
Would you prefer football?
I would prefer football, quite honestly, if we're going to talk sports.
So it's hard to say exactly this was a known issue before the storm. I'm not giving you a yes or no answer or a definitive number, but I would have to imagine it has to be in the hundreds. It was more prolific than people might recognize. We were trying to deal with it on a case-by-case basis prior to the storm, And this has just sort of opened the entire can of worms, and we're dealing out with it all one time.
But Jason, aren't we also missing a piece of that puzzle too? It's not just how many homes, which is an important policy consideration, but we are, from a policy standpoint, desperately trying to get these permits out. And if this is taking a disproportionate amount of your time and slowing down the permit approval process, that's as big of a policy issue for the town as well. So I would love to give you some guidance today so that can be less of a burden for your team, so you can move everybody forward at the same time, because it sounds like that's a big piece of your challenge today, right?
It really is, and that was the big reason that we took the step of asking to sit down with the manager and the mayor to just sort of figure out where to go next.
Well, I would yield on the side of the runner as well.
Yeah, me too. That's exactly what I heard, was staff is taking an inordinate amount of time, and we've got to, again, get out of the way. So how can we get out of the way?
And the other issue is that, you know.
You'll get in sometime, Doug.
If they can at least prove with even just pictures, I mean, if they're renting them, certainly somebody's taken a picture of the downstairs unit. And I mean, that is easy to do. But I mean, if we put out public information that you need to be on this list to prove your downstairs unit by documentation of whatever those things are up there, and it doesn't have to be all of them, but it has to be prior 1984, it has to be, you know, whatever. But that way, the people won't be afraid to come forward, and it won't still be a secret, but they have to be on the list to keep it. And the other thing was that back then is if they eliminated the rental use or the space as an apartment and made it into a home, all encompassed, that they lost the right to go back. So that was another issue back in the Marcia days. You know, and that's how the list got started. Marcia said, let's get a list, put you on it, let's go forward, then we're not going to be counting stoves and all this other stuff, we're going to move forward. And that's how the list started.
Mm-hmm.
And those people who, changed their house into all encompassed in one single dwelling, they lost the ability to have the in-law apartment later. But the fact is that if it's separated out on the tax roll, if they've been paying taxes to our town and to be on a list of a rental through our town, that should be documented enough. Somebody approved it.
Well, I think what the problem with that from staff's standpoint is when you get registered on the short-term rental list, nobody's doing a density analysis. Nobody's establishing that's a legal unit. And that's part of the problem with all of the other suggestions of what is determinative, especially if it shows up on LIPA's page. Honestly, I don't want to sound cynical, but if you encourage people to get onto the list as soon as possible and say, this is the deadline, this is the absolute last time to do it, what is going to happen is you're going to have a lot of people that are going to do as much unpermitted work to rearrange their single-family home, because quite honestly, who wouldn't want at least the opportunity to continue to be able to rent that unit if they so decided at some point in the future, or if they wanted to sell that opportunity to the next person that buys the home, because obviously if it's known to be a unit that can be rented, it can be sold for a premium.
Well, the
Hold
problem
on,
here
Jane,
is that
Jane,
we have
hold on,
lost.
just a second. He's been waiting a long time.
This is not a subject I'm any kind of expert on by any means. However, I'm hearing about the vagaries of FEMA. I'm hearing about all these things. I think, and we'd like to be lenient, we'd like to help people, but I think you're going to have to come down to that the burden of proof that this is a legal addition or supplement is going to have to be on the owner of the property, because if the town is lenient, FEMA may come back and say, wow, yeah, but did they provide all this stuff that's in your ordinance? And, well, no, it looked like they had it. We sort of trusted them, so we went ahead with it. But then that might get the town in trouble. So I think, fair or not, it's the owner of the property needs to prove that that was legally done. And if they can't prove it somehow to the meeting some of those documents, then they're stuck.
Well, a lot of those documents are gone, and that's a problem because you don't have floor plan. My floor plans are gone. My rental agreements are all gone for any of my rentals that I've had, or I don't have them in my house.
Well,
but
let me,
when I did
ma'am,
have that.
let me suggest, you can get aerial maps that go way back, different years, back to the 40s.
Yeah, but does it show the underneath of the house?
Well, probably not, but it might show another building.
Well,
Or
yeah, if it's a
outhouse.
separate building, that would
Yeah.
be super easy, but, like my rental was under my roof of my house, so the house exterior didn't change, but, the majority of them are underneath the houses.
Well, Jason, I go back to what our code says. And on the code, it says tax records. Tax records can be used as an identifiable means to show that there was a duplex.
Absolutely.
Or apartments.
Or if you get, I mean, obviously, if you can get every single one of these, that'd be perfect, but that would make your job easier.
I have a question just outside the box. And I really don't want to add more bureaucracy nor more cost, but have you thought about an independent outside person making these decisions for you guys so you can focus on
Permits at hand?
permits in hand?
I'm sorry, are you stating that it might be better to have a third-party outside group make these determinations?
That's a suggestion. Have you thought about that or considered maybe a three-member board or an outside mediator to determine this?
And it's an interesting idea. I think from staff's perspective, the only thing that we don't want to get caught in is creating basically a variance process where we have to compile all of that document, make sure that the person is ready to go and that their documents are complete and their package is complete, and then present it to a board, say multiple times during the month, because we just don't have the staff to do that. Now, if we were to send somebody that just said, well, we ran into a roadblock, we can't move forward anymore, you can now appeal my decision of no to this three-party group and bring whatever you think is relevant. That might be workable, but not if we had to create packages from the staff level like we would do for
Right.
any
I want to
other-
make it easier on you guys, and I want to make
Absolutely.
the process smoother, but I'm just trying to throw the idea out. Maybe
I think it's workable as long as we understand what the staff levels are and what the staff capability is, because otherwise I think we would have to have an entirely extra outside consulting group dedicated to nothing but getting those packages ready to hear by the three-person hearing board, let's say.
Jason?
Yes.
The challenge is, all of those, is that the property owner has to use a photograph, a diagram, or whatever to illustrate its compliance at the time of construction. So the time of construction is the thing that they really have to prove. They don't have to prove it exists.
Right.
Showing a picture that, hey, I had this, that's not enough. They have to show,
Exactly.
hey, I had this in 1962 or 1974
Right.
or 19 whatever. Okay, so
And I'm sorry, may I make just one point, just for clarification
Yep.
purposes? This is not land development code. This
That's comp.
is comp plan.
Yep.
So this is, it doesn't carry the specificity that we would expect out of land
it
development
needs to
code.
be in the land development code.
And if you look at the language, I think the intent, sorry to use that term, but I think the intent of the writers here is pretty specific, that they want to give the town the ability to create those policies and
Yep.
put them in land development
Yep.
code.
So the only other thing I want to say is, and I also would err on the side of the property owner, because I know these property owners, I mean, Mr. DeWitt, who's sitting here, he's been at a lot of meetings, they're in a rush. I mean, they're ready, as opposed to a lot of the developers that we talked about previously. So I get that. And it may be, like Jane said, the difference between somebody staying on the island or somebody leaving the island, or in the case of my friend, it will depend. That will determine whether she stays or whether she goes. But, Keith called me one day to tell me about this and said, we want to maintain our single-family neighborhoods. We want to maintain our family neighborhoods. I think it'd be a mistake for us to think that these are going to house families. So if it's an existing house that is you're rebuilding something, maybe. But if it's something that was torn down and somebody's building new structures, that likely is not going to, I see more than likely, especially if it's in a short-term rental zone, it will become a short-term rental. It's just where the market pushes, especially as expensive as things are to construct right now. But, so, I mean, I just wanted to say that because that's what I told him at start. Yeah, and that's where the homesteading part could absolutely come in that Patrick was talking about.
Can you use affidavits from prior owners or things like that? I mean, can you use MLS sheets that show that it is existing and being sold forward?
So we can use any number of things. I would think that it's not necessarily a lack of one-off information or MLS documents. I think again, I want to avoid a situation where we create a market for somebody to find the lady that's lived on that block for 40 years and she becomes the go-to for every affidavit that we collect. Not to say it wouldn't be to her benefit, not saying that she's lying about it. I'm just saying that if that's going to be the threshold that we create for this, I easily foresee that one lady getting a lot of business.
Well, it would have to be a prior owner.
And quite honestly, these houses from 1962, can you really establish, who may have owned it in 1962?
But it only has to be before 1984, truly.
That's 40 years ago.
I know.
Right, and the
that is an issue. There are people that won't be around that just sold back then, and things turn over faster now than they ever have. But there ought to be, you don't have to come up with all of those things, but you should be able to come up with a few things. Yeah, I mean,
right. But I'm sorry, when it tells us what we have here, it's such an open-ended thing here that I could send somebody off and the same day they could come back with any number of these things. Absolutely. And if it's our intent to say, well, you did the process, you did what I asked you to do, I'm good with what I'm seeing here despite the lack of specificity without the obvious gaps in the timeline, we can do it. I will just tell you again, as has been mentioned multiple times before, you're going to end up with neighborhoods that are far more short-term rentals than not.
Well, they are what they are now. I mean, if you had an in-law, your in-law may be dead and it's somebody else living in that house instead of the in-law. So the point is, these aren't new apartments. They've been here. They're existing. But that's better. They're safer. They're whatever. But the point is, the person that you're talking about had a family living down there. And, mine was a father and daughter living in that one. There are families living in here because they can't afford their own house.
Well, FEMA would disagree with your comment that it's safer.
So I think we should take a step back if we may, because Ms. Plummer, I think what you're kind of focusing on is those at grade mother-in-law's quarters. And while those are very much a FEMA concern, and very much we would like to see them moved out, even if they retain the ability to rebuild another dwelling unit elevated, that's fine. But what I'm telling you is that a vast majority, so a large minority of what we see are, as I mentioned before, these internal sort of rearrangements of what appears to be a single-family home outside. We can deal with the enclosures by looking for pre-1984 data. We've got a pretty good hook from the floodplain standpoint to determine how exactly we're going to address that. The issue is larger, and it comes up in odd ways, in odd restructurings of what you would think from the outside is just a single-family home. So I just wanted to.
Believe me, I see them, but I'm just saying that I don't think we need to make it as difficult as it appears to be. I think if you don't like using the tax roll, but it says you can use tax records. If you have pictures of a yellow, lime green, or light blue bathroom, it's probably 1956. And if these things exist somewhere in the back. And if you can, we do have email that goes back pretty far if you can come up with renters that you had, that were pre-1984, that,
Let's stop talking 1984. I'm sorry, I know that's an easy date to harp on, but if we're talking about a 1962 build, we're talking about 20 years
Right.
difference of a gap between 62
well, because
and
it was
84.
the Wild West. We don't know what was put in
Right.
there, and it didn't really matter back then.
And staff is tasked with the language that it needs to be legally applied. It needs to have been legally permitted. And so that tasks us with saying we functionally have to ignore 2 decades worth of time that is just lost to the ether.
Well, that's not really fair, because it may be on a field card somewhere, but there are no longer field cards. And that is exactly why Marshall Sequel George said, okay, we're going to stop with this of proving it. If it exists at this date, it exists.
And if your idea is to just defer to the 75 that are on that list, and that's the determination of sort of everybody up here today, staff is going to run with that, and you're still going to have hundreds of people who are caught in those what-if margins. And I'm happy to say you're not on that 75-person list, so therefore you don't have an accessory unit as far as we're concerned.
Just a question, Jason. You mentioned how difficult it is to prove that someone has this that it's legal. Is it easy to disprove it?
Not really, because we have just a general lack of documentation. If I find something like the letter that I found in here that was a determination made by another governmental organization, I'm going to give that a lot of weight. I'm not going to go back and say 25 years later I'm questioning whether he can send out a inspector to determine whether or not that build from 1962 had 3 units in it or 2 units. I just can't. So this is kind of the question of where do we defer to, and maybe the idea is maybe you defer if they give a sort of town benefit. If they're elevating their home, maybe we're more likely to say, well, the tie goes to you now, because now you're taking out of the equation the floodplain question, because you're building to today's codes.
And I think that's an important distinction, because when we talked about, well, using the runner analogy or the football analogy, it just seems like that if someone wants to rebuild below the floodplain, then the town has more responsibility for that, so the burden of proof ought to be higher. But if someone's going to rebuild a house that's been destroyed, then maybe the burden of proof is less, because they're not the whole FEMA thing's off the table.
I think that's kind of an elegant solution, and it sort of gets at 2 birds with a single stone. But that's not something that we want staff sort of cooking up one day behind the scenes and then just making it happen.
Accessory apartments.
I think that's about right. I was assuming about 25 in the list, but it could be much more than that. I mean, you can go ahead and do a count. It's pretty much in the double digits. It might reach into the triple digits briefly. But
31 per page.
I'm sorry?
31 for the first 2 pages, but I mean, this is as old as the hills is, this
It's
accessory
100.
list.
Well, I mean, it goes to 2005. They were still adding stuff in there. If you look at the very end of the document, they added 6 or 7 addresses after the fact. But again, if I'm going to rely on this 120 structure list, then that's fine. I'm going to rely on it, and that just means that there's a lot of people that have something that they don't actually have.
Well, let's bring it back so that we can give him direction one way or another. I think we could talk about this all day. Now you see why we wanted to make sure we brought it here for everybody else to have some input on it, and not just 2 people. I guess we'll just kind of go around the room and see what everybody thinks, and we'll kind of go from there. And maybe it's a strength in numbers. The only other issue I had that I wanted to ask John real quick is from a litigation standpoint. Should we tell? We've had a couple people threaten lawsuits, which seems to happen all the time anyway, but if we don't allow them to have their mother-in-law suite on the ground floor because they felt they had it before, but neither we can not prove it, it can't be proven or not proven.
The answer, I think, is 2-part. One, we can never be accused of doing something wrong if we follow our code. So that would be my first answer, which is, what does our code tell us to do, and we follow it. whether or not someone then, threatens and says, I want to rebuild at ground floor, and the code says you no longer have that ability, which is, I think, the scenario you're talking about, then, we simply, say that's not what our code says at this point.
All right.
Well, you have the right to rebuild, but you have to rebuild in a manner that's consistent with our current regulations.
Fair enough. So then I'll throw a proposal out there, and then we'll go around and see how people feel about it. I think personally, if someone can provide at least 2 of those 5 or 6 documents up there, that staff should side on the fact that it was there. I'll kind of put that up.
Ground?
What's that?
Even if it's on the ground, below BFE?
That's well, I think we certainly want to encourage elevating it, but not everyone is in the position to be able to tear the house down and elevate it or go up. So,
Right. Okay, just wanted to be clear. Thanks.
Could I add to that statement with, if they're already on the accessory list, they don't have to provide anything because they've already done it and been approved?
well, I don't have. I mean, if that list it predated the storm, obviously.
Was done when Marcia Siegel George was here.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know who that is.
2005.
Okay, I don't. Got it. I'm just trying to get to a resolution so staff can
So, I mean,
move
that
forward.
would make it simple for 130 or 50 of them. That they wouldn't have to go through the process. They're already on a list. They're approved.
We already do that. Those aren't the ones in question.
Okay. That makes
So
it
there you go.
simple.
All right. Unless someone else has a different idea of.
I'm leaning in.
There you go.
Oh, sorry. Eli Lee, planner, Town of Fort Myers Beach. It's probably the first time I ever spoken in front of you guys before, so.
No pressure.
There's
yeah.
usually not this many people here.
Only being taped too. Right?
As you guys already know, accessory apartments has always been an issue with the Town of Fort Myers Beach, even before the hurricane happened. Even when I was a code officer for the town, always the codes of complaints for illegal dwelling units on grade or below flood. It was always tough to kind of prove that these units was legal or not, and obviously Hurricane Ian kind of opened up that door for apartments to now prove to the town that your units was built, accordingly before the NFIP and things like that. So once again, it's always kind of been an issue, and it's opened up the opportunity to now for discussion to really, truly come up with a game plan for apartments to finally prove that this was legally built. Obviously, made the code department jobs a lot easier. But also, I think the main thing is that whatever we decide today, if we do make a decision today, hopefully is really, really good, because now you potentially make illegal units now legal. So I think that's very important. And yeah, it's very important. We make a decision today, or we table it for the next time. But like I say, even when I was a code officer back in 2019, the property owners always was the concern about illegal units. So I just want to, the guidance from you guys is going to be really important. But obviously we know that this is a widespread issue that unfortunately took Hurricane Ian to be addressed. So.
I remember when I first moved here, and the talk on the street was that people would build their house, and then as soon as the inspector went away, the contractor would come back in and finish downstairs. And this was 12, 13 years ago that I heard this a lot. So I really appreciate, the fact that it's pretty widespread. But I do like, I think it was Don who's saying, the idea that we put it out there, everybody's got a claim on any kind of accessory dwelling unit. They get it in now, because after, or maybe it was Pat, you set that 2022 is the line. And after that, we know that it wasn't there.
To get us back on track to what the mayor's trying to do, originally I would want to try and solve this problem today, because that's why I thought it was brought to us. But more and more, I'm feeling maybe what we need to do what John Heron suggested, send it back to staff, put more meat on the bones, what is really the important ones that you would see, because I heard, Mayor, I thought you said at least 2 of those. I don't know if staff is comfortable with that, and then bring it back. That's at least what I'm feeling.
I'm completely fine with that too.
And I think it's really got to be, you know, because you've got to protect yourself too, because if we leave it too vague, then it opens them up for all kinds of, you know, abuse and lawsuits.
Just in the interest of time, I'm sorry, Jason, are you comfortable with the mayor just suggested in terms of the two? Because boy, I'd sure like to get this monkey off your back.
You know, if that's the threshold, I think if we choose anything off of that list, whether it be 2, 3, or 5, people are going to find those documents. And if we're being asked not to dig too deep into those and just say, if you've collected 5 of these, you've got 5 gold rings, you've got a unit. I just would be cautious to say that there are many people that live out there next to a unit that they claim they have 3 or 4 or 5 dwelling units in a neighborhood. And if you grant them amnesty, that is what it's going to be. And it will be forever and a day.
The more I hear you talk, Jason, the more you won't say it, but the more I can hear you leaning on, I don't think this is a good idea. So I think the idea of going back, let John and staff work through it, to going around the pig to get the ham sandwich, is that what we
Mr. Mayor, I think I'd like to see where we talked about if someone was going to rebuild according to current FEMA rules, to have some leniency associated with that. And also this idea of is it going to be someone that is homesteaded also?
I think it's important.
Some kind of leniency.
I like that too.
Yeah.
You know, just another thing to throw out there, and Eli and Jason, I don't know if this troubles you or makes you ponder, but the comp plan also tells us to limit density when possible. And so by let's say we've eliminated all of these units at this point, what do we put back? Because it does give you an opportunity to rethink those neighborhoods, rethink those streets, rethink those situations where there was potentially an illegal the worry is memorializing or legitimizing what were not really legitimate units. I don't want to say illegal. Legitimate doesn't sound much better, but do you know what? Anyway, that's all. That's all.
Is everyone comfortable with that direction for John and staff to get to work? You sure you don't need more work, John?
I would phrase to get back to work.
Do we want to put a timeline on this so we can get it addressed quickly, or?
Can I just have a question here? So when we talk about legal or non-legal or legal non-conforming, all that kind of stuff, that's based on the 1984 pre-firm with FEMA, correct?
Incorrect. Okay, so there are two generally overlapping concerns. You've got floodplain, which says that pre-1984 or pre-firm, if the unit is there and we can establish that is pre-1984, then if the structure doesn't need to be elevated, or excuse me, the lower unit or what is below base flood elevation is not required to be elevated. It's the idea of the federal government giving grandfathering to people whose structures existed prior to the codes.
Okay.
What we're dealing with here is a matter of local density. It may be that the question of whether that mother-in-law's quarters down below is pre or post 1984 and whether it was actually a legal unit. They may overlap. But I keep going back to the point that it doesn't have to be. Very often it's a question of somebody has really just locked off a portion of the inside of the home or restructured it and added a second kitchen to it and is holding it out and has been holding it out for rent for decades perhaps. But the pre-firm we've got a lot more leverage to deal with those because we have federal statutes. In the lack of federal or state statutes to deal with this local issue and only with this snippet from the comp plan, that's where our question is really coming from.
Should there be a different standard for like single-family residential zoning? Or like, you may have a legal mother-in-law apartment in your house that goes back to wherever. But at some point in time, your neighborhood was zoned residential, single-family residential. What happens there?
I don't know that I understand the implication you're getting
Well,
at
I
here.
think there's some zoning that allows multifamily, and there's zoning that's supposed to
Yeah.
be single-family residential.
Two-thirds of our single-family residential would technically allow for a duplex, for instance.
Oh, okay.
If you meet the density, if your lot is large enough to meet the density calculation. Yes, the problem is that, remember, the zoning was overlaid only once we became a town. I can't establish what under Lee County or way back in the midst of the 60s with Lee County, what that zoning was and whether they stuck to it or whether something was done as a weekend special and just sort of evolved there and then showed up on MLS in 1989.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think is there a motion to adjourn?
The game's over, you mean?
Are we talking about just this item, or are we, the other item that we started with, are we going back to that in any way?
Do we need to?
Well, I'd like to bring up, I had a discussion at the break with Tom Torgerson, and I think Tom brought up some good points that I think could give guidance moving forward.
Have we finished discussion on the first
Yeah.
one, though, and everybody got bought? I guess assume you're wanting consensus on this. Have we reached consensus to send it back to staff, flesh it out, bring it back, or?
Yeah, I thought we covered that.
Okay, I just wanted to make
Yep.
sure.
Knock yourself out, Patrick.
Okay. What Tom.
Thank you very much.
What Tom was telling me is, in listening to all the comments in our previous discussion, he said, well, if we kept the FARs the way they were, but calculated the FAR without the parking garages underneath, we calculated height from BFE, and we eliminated this conversion, density conversion, and we just use the FAR as a box, you now have consistency across the board and no confusion. And I said, yeah, you're correct. That would eliminate the confusion, and the consistencies would happen throughout the comp plan. The other thing also is your floors calculated from BFE also. In that right now, if it's 3 floors and you're using it as parking, it wouldn't count as a floor. So I think if those things were corrected, you would have consistency throughout your comp plan. I think the direction could be to staff, can you evaluate them, bring it back to us? I don't think we're here to make a decision today, but I think if they did evaluate that, bring it back to us, and then we could look at it in a little more detail and recommend, as an LPA, recommend something, then you guys decide eventually.
You know, one point just that came up to me is that if we're currently including the ground floor in the FAR calculation, and we remove that, we're essentially increasing the FAR.
Yes. Yes. It would be a slight increase, but instead of across the board, like the consultant was suggesting, maybe a 3 or a 5 or whatever, the only increase we'd be looking at right now would be the increase from not counting that ground floor.
Could I, again, I'm visual, so can I just make sure that I'm clear on this? Because I think I tend to agree with this. But if here's the ground, and now here's where my, I'm going to use Sea Gypsy, may I? Here's Sea Gypsy. Here was Sea Gypsy. And now, let's say Sea Gypsy goes here. We're not counting this space against him. And before, he had 6 in this box. And now, because we're going to eliminate the number, he still has the same floor area ratio, but he could have 25 or 10 or whatever he can put in that box.
It wouldn't be 25.
No, but I mean, no, I'm just saying, but that's the idea. The box remains the same. The space it takes up in the world remains the same. It's just the number inside changes. Is that
Correct.
accurate?
That you would use the box rather than a
Than a
density
number.
conversion
So
tool.
I'll tell you something. I I had a conversation about, Bill, did we talk about this the other day? I talked to Bill, I don't know. Okay. I do not know what our obsession was about this. Maybe Jane, you'll remember. We were obsessed about this back in the olden days, and I don't know. The only thing I could come up with was if we said, okay, now in your box, you can have 20 instead of 6. Now we've got 20 cars instead of 6 cars. Now we've got 20 families instead of 6 families. So it is an increase in the intensity, not necessarily the density. And so I think we got a little obsessed with intensity. Now so long as we talk about that, I don't know. It's a possible solution, especially for some of the smaller properties.
See, I think I would still consider that more density, though, because you're talking more cars.
But it's not.
Well,
That's
I
intensity.
I think let's all be careful with density is for residential dwelling units. Intensity is a commercial measure. Okay?
Oh,
The problem
I
with
always
our
thought it was
code and
the
our
same
comp
thing.
plan is we start with a density measure, which is for residential,
Yep.
and we convert it.
And we convert,
Okay?
that's why.
It's a bastardization of a land use tool. That's what it is. And it's very confusing to everybody.
But-
So does it create more trips? Granted, if you have more units, it will grant more trips. But again, those places are destroyed right now. We don't have any. Okay? And I did my personal analysis of how much traffic that I think the hotel units probably generate of total traffic on this island. It's probably less than 5%. Because right now, when it comes to the number of units, hotel units, well, according to the 1990 comp plan, hotel units account for less than about 14% of all units. So, and they generate less traffic. One hotel unit generates less than a residential unit. So de facto, you're at less than 15% traffic, and then you have to factor in all the day trippers and all the service workers that come in. So we are at somewhere less than 15. So even if we were to increase our total hotel units by, let's say, 50%, it's a very small amount of that total traffic. And what we're talking about here would apply to commercial and lodging. It would not apply to residential units.
I do think, there's always, like Sarah pointed out, there's always some other factor that come in. So if Scott could fit 20 units in his footprint, he couldn't make the parking requirements.
Correct.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I'd be limited at the amount of parking, but still, it'd give me way more relief than what I'm looking at now.
Now, we have a post-disaster build-back program, and that doesn't allow people to build back what they had essentially, but it's like the number of units and the size of those units.
Yes. You can replace a non-conforming hotel motel in full conformance with the current provisions of the code. So that's the number of density units times the multiplier based on the size of the room, whatever district it's in. The other way you can do it is by, in the same manner as provided for enlargements to the various types of non-conforming buildings. So we'd have to look into exactly what that is, but I know we've gone over that with Scott. And then the other one is within the pre-disaster build-back regulations, and those require the same size units. And that's really a problem for a lot of older hotels, a lot of older homes.
So
because
post does not, but pre does?
pre and post require the same size.
I think we need to distinguish that we are not applying pre-disaster in any way.
Oh,
'cause
no.
We've had the disaster at
Sorry.
this point.
Yes.
So you're either going post-disaster, and post-disaster, just to clarify, folks, is if you have 4 hotel units right now, and they are lodging units, you cannot apply the multiplier. The only way you can apply the multiplier if you say my base density, for example, is 6 dwelling units per acre. Then you could start with a density amount that is allowed through your comp plan designation, apply the multiplier based on the size of the rooms, and if that is more than what you have today, I would say go that route. But, if you have more hotel units than that ratio would give you, that's what your grandfathered That's what is vested, that's what you can rebuild.
And for clarification, it's pre and post, so I'm sorry I didn't read through the entire sentence, but it's they're the same essentially. You do it before, you do it after. So same size units.
So Patrick, since you said you talked with Tom Torgerson about it, let's use Margaritaville as an example. Say in today's world now, let's say that was the case. You did not use the first elevation, their parking garage, as any calculations into the FAR. What would that building look like? Or what could it look like?
Well, apparently he did not maximize his FAR, okay? So what Tom is saying. So in Tom's case, if we were just to calculate the FAR differently, basically he could add a floor to his hotel in the future.
Then he has the issue of height.
Yeah. So again, I don't know exactly, I think he was at somewhere less than the maximum. So today, he could come back in and ask for more. He could do that, he's got that right today. But if we just change the calculation, essentially he could be asking for, an extra floor. But again, those things are, I don't think we're talking about giving any of this away by right. We are asking that, in most cases, people have to come in and request it.
So could it be worded, or does it have to be across the board? Does it either have to be base flood elevation, or it has to be ground, or can it be if you don't want to use if you do not want to?
Yes, if you put retail at the bottom, that is floor area for sure. But if you're not putting any either living space or commercial space,
Okay.
then yeah. And then
that's what I was
to further complicate things, also if you do a true mixed use, where you have residential and commercial, that confuses things. It's not easy for the public. Typically, most jurisdictions just go to an FAR. And yes, the density is different than the commercial, but since you're doing a mixed-use project, most jurisdictions just use the FAR across the board.
Nothing to it.
If I may, Patrick, your brilliant loquaciousness is potentially disrupting our ability to have our ad hoc school call at 5 o'clock. So if we could table your brilliance for just a bit, and I'll let you wrap up, Mr. Mayor, but then I would move we adjourn.
Well, I'm as wrapped as I'm going to get. So there's a motion. Motion is second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none? We're out of here.
Bridge to FAR.